Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We have a full house, and I know it's not here because of me. So thank you for being here. So we're going to start with some preliminary matters before we get to the more interesting presentations. So the first item is item number one, preliminary matters. We have 10 resolutions to approve this morning. We'll do the first 9 together and then the last one separately. So the first one is the Tregoning property number 120230120 MCPB number 23-118. The second is the Tregoning property Forest Conservation Plan F20230420 MCPB number 23119. The third is 1415 Mount Nebo Road Subdivision Plan 620230130 MCPB number 23-121. The fourth is 14915 Mount Nebo Road Forest Conservation Plan F20230420 MCPB number 23-122. The fifth is Buck Lodge Track 119890320 MCPB number 23-130. The sixth is 7749 Old Georgetown Road, sketch plan number 320240010 MCPB number 230131. 7 is Retail Shops 15504 New Hampshire Avenue, preliminary plan 119991008 MCPB number 23-132. The eighth is Retail Shops 15504 New Hampshire Avenue, Forest Conservation Plan F20230130 MCPB number 23-134. And the ninth is pursuant to remand adoption of Georgia Avenue Sketch Plan number 320230020 resolution MCPB number 23-137. Do I have a motion for approval?
Yeah, move to approve the resolutions.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The last resolution is Garnick Farms preliminary plan number 1200824A MCPB number 23-135. All can vote except Commissioner Bartley. Do I have a motion for approval?
Move for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. The second is
Can
approve.
I make one quick
Yeah,
comment?
yes,
if
please.
That's okay. I just wanted to point out that the resolution for the Georgia Avenue remand, it does include references to cases and legal provisions that Mr. Mills cited in his presentation to the board last week. I also wanted to note that there was substantial attendance at the pre-submission meeting. So both of these things are just helpful in understanding our findings and the board's analysis and reasoning last week. So thanks.
Thank you for presenting that. Thank you. We'll move on to approval of minutes. We have 2 minutes of November 2nd, 2023, and November 30th, 2023, and then closed session minutes of November 2nd, 2023, and November 30th, 2023. Do I have a motion for approval?
Motion to approve the minutes.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, the ayes have it. And our third item, we have to do independently, each one independently. There are 3 extension requests. The first is Limedo Administrative Preliminary Plan Number 620230100, Regulatory Review Extension Request Number 1, where staff is recommending approval to the extension request. Is there a motion for approval?
I move to approve.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, the ayes have it. The second is 12700 Travilla Road Preliminary Plan Number 120220120, Extension Request Number 1, where staff is recommending approval of the extension. Do I have a motion for approval?
I move for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 The ayes have it. The last is Milestone Center Walmart Site Plan Amendment Number 81994091, Regulatory Extension Request Number 2. Do I have where staff is recommending approval of the extension request. Do I have a motion for approval?
I move to approve the request.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. Thank you so much. So now we're going to move on to the roundtable discussion, the Parks Director's report. But before we do that report, I have an important presentation to make. So Mike, can you come maybe sit next to your wife? So good morning again. I have a proclamation here from the board. And so it starts out by first, you always have to do the regulatory, so they, hear ye, okay? This is a resolution from the board. Whereas Mike Riley has served the residents of Montgomery County for 39 years, beginning his career at Montgomery Parks, part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, as a humble civil and environmental engineer, and rising to the position of Parks Director. And whereas Mike Riley first mastered the skills of precision and attention to detail while working in a donut assembly line, and learned adaptability and resilience from jobs as an emu feeder and a gas station attendant. While scraping grease off elevator cables may seem like a distant memory, these early experiences laid the foundation for the hard work, determination, and problem-solving abilities that define Mike's career in public service. And whereas over 4 decades as a civil and environmental engineer at Montgomery Parks, Mike Riley has personally witnessed the advent of modern environmental sustainability practices and regulations. To wit, one of his first projects was to fill in wetlands, to build a soccer field, and then later years, he oversaw the removal of that same field and the restoration of the original environmental resource. And whereas Mike Riley is the only Parks Director to hold a Maryland professional engineering license, which he proudly banishes to colleagues, residents, and other governmental agencies or elected officials at any level. And whereas Mike Riley has captured the great vessel of the SS Montgomery Parks through some of its strongest headwinds and stormiest nights, including the pre-dawn hours in late June 2006, when water began emerging at the base of Lake Needwood, and he was thrust before national television cameras to calm fears and instill confidence. That's Mike. Mike has met this challenge head-on and stood watch over a massive operation to protect and restore the integrity of this high-hazard dam in the heart of Montgomery County, after which more than 2,000 residents were able to safely return to their homes to celebrate the 4th of July with their families. And whereas Mike Riley's legacy includes the 2022 PROS Plan, which establishes the framework for an equitable park system that creates opportunities for social connection, environmental activity, and protects our environmental resources. And whereas Mike Riley led projects both big and small, including Maryland Soccerplex, the Josiah Henson Museum, North Four Corners Local Park, the Visitor Center at Brookside Gardens, and the Shirley Povich Field. And whereas Mike Riley leaves Montgomery Parks as one of its biggest advocates, having managed more than 400 parks, 37,000 acres, and a parks family of over 1,100 people, all of you. Under his leadership, Montgomery Parks was awarded a 6th gold medal for Best in the Nation from the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration, an unprecedented record that is still held today. And whereas Mike Riley has served as the unofficial storyteller of the park system, and we're looking forward to reading his tell-all bestseller about his time at the commission. And whereas those of us who have had the pleasure to work with and get to know Mike are so better for it. Therefore, be it resolved that the Montgomery County Planning Board of the National Capital Park and Planning Commission hereby express the commission's admiration and appreciation to Mike for 39 years of outstanding service and dedication to the commission and wishes him the very best of health and happiness in the years to come. From the Montgomery County Planning Board, December 21, 2023. Congratulations, Mike. Oh, yeah. Yeah, kill it, yeah. Where would you like Mike?
Yeah, he could come sit over here, and that way it would be super awkward for him.
Unless you leave from on high.
Would you like us to move on to the Parks Director
Yeah, yes,
roundtable?
yeah, this
Okay.
is the Parks Director Roundtable, and
And I have some slides that
Yes,
I'll be
please.
moving through. Okay. This would have been today Mike's last Parks Directors Roundtable with the Planning Board, but the staff and I decided that we were going to do a little takeover, stage a coup, if you will. And with the help of Dominique Carlo, we put together some slides to walk you through that will just give me an opportunity to talk about Mike and maybe make him feel a little bit sheepish, because we're trying to take every opportunity we can to give Mike the send-off he deserves. So this opening slide, I think you can see here, that this picture is emblematic of the dignity and the gravity that Mike brought to his role as Parks Director. All kidding aside, this is basically what he told me the job would be, and that's why I applied. So I'm going to hold everyone to that. Here we've got a little timeline of Mike's 39 years now with the commission. He graduated from college in 1985 from Clarkson University with a bachelor's in civil and environmental engineering. His sister cut out from the Washington Post an ad for a civil engineer with the commission, and Mike applied for that job. He interviewed for 7 jobs. He got 4 job offers. It's pretty good. He picked the lowest paying job. But I think he did that because he knew that a career designing and building parks would be truly rewarding. I doubt he knew when he took this job that it would be 39 years, but here we are. Here we are. It was a good decision. Subsequently, he was promoted pretty steadily. By 2001, he was chief of PDD. I think this board is all familiar with Andy Frank, our current division chief for PDD, and that's the job that Mike Riley used to have. In 2007, he became the deputy director under Mary Bradford, and he was appointed in 2014 our parks director here in Montgomery Parks. So Mike has given over the course of his almost 10 years as Parks Director, give or take, over 200 different planning board roundtable reports. We very carefully crunched the data on that. And basically, it's twice a month, 11 months out of the year, because we don't do this in August, for like 9 years, roughly comes to about 200. So Mike did this a lot. This is my first one. It turns out, you guys, that beerologist is a real term. It's a term for somebody who is basically a beer enthusiast. And one of the things that Mike, I think, is proud of is that in his tenure as Parks Director, he approved more liquor licenses to serve beer at Parks events than any director previously. And this is a good thing because...
Including the one for my retirement party that I'm going to
There
approve
you
today at Brookside.
There you go. This is good because we want people to come into our parks and, enjoy themselves, have a beer on a beautiful day with their friends and family and neighbors. And it's all part of the environment of joy and fun and connection that we're trying to create in Montgomery Park. So I will try to pick up that mantle and approve many more licenses. All right, so we went through some of Mike's performance evaluations over the years, and I think you all know that like once a year your supervisor rates you on a scale and then has the opportunity to say some words in writing, to put down some words to kind of tell you what kind of a year you had and how you performed over the last year. And so I just want to read a couple of these to you because I think they're worth hearing out loud. In 2004, Les Straw, who was then the superintendent of parks, said in Mike's performance evaluation, I believe this has been a very good year for this division and Mr. Riley. I appreciate his hard work, attention to detail, and good nature. And I think if you know Mike, that's pretty much on point. In 2008, Mary Bradford, director at the time, wrote that Mr. Riley is the sort of individual who consistently rises to the challenge of whatever is placed before him and can be relied upon to tackle it with the thoroughness and precision of an engineer, but also with increasing flexibility in the face of uncertain outcomes. For these reasons, my evaluation of Mike Riley is that he is an exemplary professional, a credit to this department and to the commission, and I therefore rate him highly across all categories. I think we can all agree with that assessment, too. So one of the privileges that Mike has had over the years is, well, he approves a lot of the purchases the Parks Department makes, and a lot of them are, they're prosaic, they're mundane, right? The kind of supplies everybody has to order and approve, but some of them are pretty special. And so we've pictured some of them here. You can see that Mike has purchased a train, he's purchased a carousel, a pump track, a sawmill, a climbing wall. I think that's a Zamboni, some kayaks, and there's a drone. And then, of course, I think her name is Penny. She is the dog at Brookside who chases away the geese, and by all accounts, she's a very good girl.
I see Chief McSwain here. Don't forget guns and tasers.
Yeah. We won't forget that. So here are some pictures of Mike at ribbon cuttings over the years. The job of Parks Director, even though Mike always made it look easy, it's long hours. Sometimes it's stressful. Sometimes people are unhappy with the status of a project. Something might be over budget or maybe now and then run late, even though we make every effort for that not to happen. Sometimes somebody's unhappy with the condition of their park. But it's all worth it when you go to the ribbon cutting and you see the happy faces of the children as they play on that playground for the very first time. You see the elected officials and the residents who get an opportunity to see what it is that we do for them with the resources that they give us and how hard we work to deliver for them. And so Mike has always loved those events. And among his words of wisdom to me has always been, remember this when things are hard. Remember that this is why we do this job. Some of his major projects as the chair outlined in that resolution. The Brookside Gardens Visitor Center, the Soccerplex, North Four Corners Park, but there are hundreds of projects that Mike had a hand in over the 39 years. From his first role as a lowly civil engineer, none of them are lowly, up to being the parks director. There is so much in our system that exists because Mike had a hand in it. And then here we just have some pictures of Mike with parks staff. And I want to highlight this for you because I think you can see in everyone's face how they feel about Mike, what Mike has meant to park staff over the years. He has been an exemplary public servant, and his staff have the utmost regard and affection for him. He sets the standard. His decency, integrity, good humor, and commitment to doing the right thing even when it's hard, because that's what he's paid to do, is something that we should all strive for. He's been a role model for me, and I think I can speak for our staff when I say that having him at the helm has been a source of comfort, confidence, and stability for all of us. So I just want to say happy retirement, Mike, and thank you for everything you've done for the Parks Department and for the residents of Montgomery County for the last 39 years. We are all very grateful.
Wow. Thank you. I'm really overwhelmed, and this is where I get to practice holding it together for my retirement party. That was wonderful, Mitty. Thank you, and everybody who put those pictures together. It was an incredible trip down memory lane. Thank you, Artie and the board. The proclamation was the most personalized, genuine proclamation I've ever heard. Quite often when you hear people read all those whereases, there's really not a lot of customized personal things there. But that was absolutely wonderful. First and foremost, before I forget, my lovely wife, Joy Riley, is here today. If any of you, those nice words, if any of you kind of have this picture of me walking around calm, collected, on top of things, knowing what's going on, Joy bore the brunt of that. When I would walk in the door at 6 o'clock or whenever, it would be, Joy, you don't believe what effing happened today with those, So I did a good job faking it all these years with my calm, cool, collected demeanor. But I just, and my legacy, it is true, it's the beer. There's no question. More beer has flowed in the last 10 years in the parks. And, when we started, I don't want to delve too much into that, but when we started that discussion, there was a lot of fear about what the worst would happen. And, I'm very pleased to say that we've had a lot of socializing, a lot of festivities, a lot of fun in our park, and all those horrible things people thought would happen because we allowed alcohol in public spaces did not materialize. So, it's one of the things I'm proud of with the Parks Department is we're willing to try things even when there may be some doubt, and then gauge how they work. One of the things I'm really proud of is I feel like I'm leaving this organization in tip-top shape with Artie and the board, with Mitty, with Jason, with my senior leadership team, all top-notch people. And I just truly, feel like I'm going out on top. And I feel blessed and fortunate because that doesn't happen for everybody. You don't get to go out on your own terms, on your own choice when you feel things are all good, and I'm getting to do that. So I thank you all for that, and I owe a lot of people thanks for that. I think the thing that motivated me all these years, and you're saying all these nice things about me, but I truly have remained motivated for the whole 38 years because of a belief as Mitty showed in those ribbon cuttings, that we in parks can just go out in the system and see how what we do makes a difference. It's very easy. If you go to the Capitol Crescent Trail, if you go take a hike at Little Bennett, if you go to one of the Acoustics and Ales events, if you go to a Saturday morning where we have a lot of fields and watching the kids play, whatever it is, the ice rinks, a therapeutic riding center, I could go on, but there's just never been a doubt in my mind that the reason 800 plus or minus park employees come to work every day is we're making a big, big difference for Montgomery County. And when people brag about Montgomery County being one of the best counties in the country and one of the greatest places to live, you almost always hear parks talked about early on in that discussion. So I just hope for all of you that you keep that front and center no matter what you do, no matter what your role is in parks, that you're always making a difference. You know, another thing I tell people, particularly when I'm recruiting people, is you really want to work for parks if you're a curious person, because we have so many smart subject matter experts working in parks that are really the smartest people in the state in what they do, whether it's environmental engineering and stream restoration or historical and cultural interpretation, a whole gamut of things. There's experts here that have a fascinating amount of knowledge about what they do, and I've tried to bring some of those topics to the board to expose you to them, and I would recommend Mitty continue to do that from time to time with different specialties. A lot of you saw, I was fortunate enough to be interviewed by John Kelly in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. It was really fun. I was happy the way the article turned out. He wrote his last article this morning himself. I don't know if I inspired him in any way, but he's wrapping it up too. But as he was musing about, a lot of people had written to him about do's and don'ts and retirements and ideas and concepts. And one of those concepts was don't try to do too much too fast. So I'm going to abide by that. Joy and I are remaining in Kensington. We're going to still be in Montgomery County, so I'm not going to entirely disappear, but I plan to hibernate at least in January and February and do a lot of nothing with Joy and maybe some fun things too. We'll go back and forth this year to the condo we just bought in Bethany Beach, which we're excited about. But then maybe later on in the year, you'll start seeing me pop up here and there, and I'll stop by for social events and parties and things like that. But it has been a great ride. I just, if I started thanking people, we would be here all morning. But, I just don't think many people get to have a job where they feel that probably 90% of the time they're really happy and excited about what they're doing, and the other 10% is the headaches that inevitably come along. But that's kind of how I feel. I feel fortunate and blessed. I've got a ton of people to thank. But thank you all for a wonderful, wonderful morning. Thank you. Now I have work to do. I have an item.
Artie, may I speak for
Oh, yes,
just a minute?
please.
Just very briefly.
Okay, come on.
So,
Maybe it was already.
Okay. So I want to tell you what our lives were really like. Artie mentioned that Michael had to fix the dam in Lake Nadewood. Well, it turns out the day that the dam was perking, I was at a conference in Las Vegas for my job. And Michael was here, obviously, and our poor children were home with a babysitter. So given the time change, I'm in Nevada, and I get up at 6 a.m., and I turn on CNN. And I see my husband standing on top of a dam. And of course, CNN is, and I knew nothing about it, CNN is reporting that the dam's gonna break. And there's my husband standing right on top. So I picked up my cell phone and I call him. And I see him on television answer his phone. And I said, Michael, get off the dam. And he said, Joy, I have to fix the dam. And to which I said, Michael, you do not have to fix the dam standing on top of it when it's about to break. And yeah, so that's what our lives were like. Anyway, he did not get off the dam. The dam did not break. And I came home and we were, again, a happy family. But I'm thinking, you know, I'm halfway across the country, more than halfway across the country. My husband's about to be swept to his death, and our children are home with a babysitter. That's what life with parks was really like.
Well, thank you so much.
Sincerely.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to have this event this morning. Thank you, Mike. And we're going to take a 2-minute break, and we'll start with our next item number 5, the designation of the Royce Hanson Conservation Park and Broad Run. Thank you. Good morning again. We're on item number 5, designation of Royce Hansen Conservation Park at Broad Run, where staff is recommending approve the proposed designation of Royce Hansen Conservation Park at Broad Run. And Parks member Dominique Harlow will give the presentation this morning. Welcome, Dominique.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Wonderful. So good morning. For the record, my name is Dominique Harlow, and I'm the Chief of Staff for the Director's Office for the Montgomery Parks Department. I'm excited to be before the board this morning, not only to talk about this name designation, but also for Director Riley's last planning board item before he retires in about a week. So today I'm here to talk about the legacy of Dr. Royce Hansen and request that the board approve the designation of Royce Hansen Conservation Park at Broad Run. So to begin, I'll talk a little bit about Dr. Royce Hansen. Dr. Hansen served 2 terms as the chair of the Montgomery County Planning Board. The first term was from 1972 to 1981, and again from 2006 to 2010. I think it's important to note, under his first term, one of the county's greatest successes was the creation of the Ag Reserve, which serves as a model for jurisdictions around the country. Montgomery County's Ag Reserve sets aside 93,000 acres of land in Montgomery County, which is equivalent to 1/3 of the county. This land is designated for preservation and farming while also preventing urban sprawl. The Ag Reserve also won the 2017 APA National Planning Excellence Award for Planning Landmark. I'll go more into detail later about the importance of the Ag Reserve, but I thought it was important to mention at the beginning of this presentation. In addition to serving on the Montgomery County Planning Board, Dr. Hansen also served as the president of the Maryland Environmental Trust, chair of the Montgomery County Department of Parks Legacy Open Space Advisory Group, and a board member for the Montgomery County Parks Foundation from 2009 to 2022. In addition to the various public service contributions made by Dr. Hansen, he is also an author, an educator, an urban planner, and even has an award named after him by the Montgomery Countryside Alliance. So that is quite a resume, which it's no wonder that soon after Dr. Hansen left the board in 1981, that the new board approved the naming and dedication of Royce Hansen Urban Park in downtown Silver Spring. This park was located just outside of the Silver Spring Montgomery Regional Office Building, also known as MRO. This was home to the Montgomery County Planning Board as well as the Montgomery County Planning Department. I actually worked in that building for quite some time, and you'll see in the picture to the right here, there are picnic tables underneath of those trees there, and that's where staff would go to have lunch. It was also a place where people would congregate before or after a planning board item. And there was even a little community garden in the center back there, you can see, where staff would grow fruits and vegetables on their lunch break or after work. So as you might imagine, Royce Hansen Urban Park and MRO are no longer in existence. So we're sitting in downtown Wheaton in this new Wheaton headquarters building. Park and planning staff moved to Wheaton headquarters in September 2020 during the pandemic. Prior to that, in 2014, a mandatory referral was submitted for the disposition of Royce Hansen Urban Park and MRO. The staff report included language that said, and I quote, "The Parks Department will need to address the relocation of Royce Hansen Park that is currently sited on the property to a more appropriate site." The staff report was then approved by the Planning Board in 2014. A subsequent letter was sent to the applicant in which the chair at the time, Francois Carrier, noted, and the quote is up there on the right, that the Parks Department will need to address the relocation of Royce Hansen Urban Park to another appropriate site, thus reinforcing the significance of the dedication. I think it's important to note that the Parks Department does have an individual naming and dedication policy. The policy was not in effect in 1981 when the naming was approved for Royce Hansen Urban Park. The policy that was eventually established has seen a few updates over the years, with the most recent update occurring in May 2020, which added additional criteria to establish commemorative naming. Dr. Hansen meets most of the criteria of the updated policy. However, it's Parks' recommendation that the board continue to honor the decisions made by the previous planning boards in 1981 and again in 2014. So staff did what was asked of them and analyzed approximately 36 existing park sites to determine a suitable location for this park. The committee was comprised of numerous staff from the Parks and Planning departments, as well as members from the Parks Foundation. Scoring criteria was based on prominence, accessibility, use, and naming difficulty of the park. The team ultimately decided on Broad Run Conservation Park for the reassignment for a variety of reasons. The first is that it was located or is located in the Ag Reserve. If you remember from my first slide about Dr. Hansen, he was often referred to as the architect of the Ag Reserve, so this site couldn't be more fitting for it. The park was also designated as Legacy Open Space Best of the Best Natural Resource in 2008. It is 472-acre site that supports opportunities for trail connectivity, education, and natural resources stewardship, as well as resource-based recreational activities, including primitive camping, fishing, picnicking, multi-use trails for hiking, running, horseback riding, etc. Timing could not be more perfect for this naming. The property was acquired back in 2021 with a 2-year reservation term that actually just ended earlier this month, I believe on December 17th. Dr. Hansen was conferred with after a site selection was made and had some recommendations on partnerships and fundraising opportunities. This is a great way to honor Dr. Hansen's legacy while growing the next generation of environmentalists. He did discuss the opportunity of fundraising with the Montgomery County Parks Foundation, and Director Riley did reach out and they did express interest. Fundraising could cover a variety of park amenities and/or educational opportunities. He also asked that we reach out to partner with Poolsville High School's Global Ecology Program. This is a great program that offers students the opportunity to get out twice a month to explore and investigate historical and cultural issues related to the Earth's natural resources. And the last request that he had was to explore potential for farm incubators on cropland. We plan to look into these ideas. We have not ironed those out. And for the purposes of this designation, they don't need to be approved. But it was just something that we thought was an interesting way to continue to honor his legacy. So in summary, we are requesting that the board approve Resolution 23-136 for the designation of Royce Hansen Urban Park at Broad Run. Any questions?
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the board members? Yes.
I just have a comment.
Sure.
I remember that I was working on site selection when I was at the Parks Department, and we had a lot of sites. And I remember, the last one I remember, I think it was the entrance at Little Bennett Park. That's what we left it at. But I think that project never come to be realized, correct?
That's correct. The first committee did settle on the day use area at Little Bennett Park.
Yeah.
It's an area that was along 355 that was envisioned to be a place with active amenities where families could go spend the better
Yeah.
part of a day, something like Wheaton Regional Park. It had a very, very high price tag, I believe $10 million or more. It was at one time funded in the CIP, and then during some challenging years for the county with general obligation bonds, we were asked to cut tens of millions of dollars out of our CIP, and that project was basically indefinitely deferred.
Yeah, I
So
hope
whether it comes back to the board
yeah.
someday,
It was a beautiful project,
Yeah.
but I did work under Royce Hansen, and I have the word of respect for him. And this is actually seems like that maybe it's even a better option because it's right in Ag Reserve and everything. So when I look at it, when I started looking at it in a packet this week, and I saw Royce Hansen, oh my God, this is not done yet. I thought it was a done deal. So well deserved. I totally support it, and it looks like that a perfect match.
Thank you. Yeah, it was something that Director Riley had requested that we bring to the board before he left. So we're glad that we were able to bring it to you before he retires. And I do want to note here on this last slide, it does say the designation of Royce Hansen Urban Park at Broad Run, and that should say Conservation Park.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Well, thank you for your presentation. It was wonderfully given, and yes, I'm so happy that you were able to do this, especially before Mike leaves. Royce also meant a lot to me. I mean, my first month here, he came and talked to me about how to be a great chair and his thoughts on that, and he gave me his new book that he wrote about regionalism, which was very, very important. So, yeah, thank you. And if there are no other questions or comments, do I have a motion to approve the proposed designation of the Royce Hansen Conservation Park at Broad Run and adopt the resolution?
Yeah, I move to approve the designation of Royce Hansen Conservation Park at Broad Run.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, the ayes have it. Congratulations, Royce. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll take a 2-minute break, and we'll start with item number 6, zoning text amendment 23-08, transferable development rights cemetery, public hearing. Thank you. Good morning. We're on item number 6, zoning text amendment ZTA 23-08, transferable development rights - cemetery, where staff is recommending transmit comments to the district council. So this morning, we have Ben Berbert to give the presentation for the planning staff. Good morning, Ben.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Ben Berbert for the record with the Countywide Planning and Policy Division. As you said, this is a presentation on ZTA 2308, Transfer Development Rights Cemeteries. This is the high-level overview. Staff is recommending that the Planning Board transmit a memo to the District Council in support of ZTA 2308 as it's been introduced. It was introduced back on November 7th by Councilmember Balcom. There is a public hearing that is scheduled for this ZTA on January 16th, 2024. And what this ZTA would do is it would modify the list of uses that are currently prohibited in the zoning ordinance from being developed on land that's encumbered by transfer development right easement by allowing cemeteries to expand, although not necessarily create new on such land. What this sort of looks like in Code Ease, as I like to call it, you can see here under 59315, transferable development rights, subsection 4, where the commercial lists are, and then C, cemeteries, adding the word unless expanding existing cemetery. I briefly just want to make sure we all sort of understand the idea of this transfer development right easement. Transfer development rights was a program established back in the early 1980s as part of the Agricultural Reserve and the master plan out there that created a compensation mechanism for landowners to sell these development rights that they used to have before they were downzoned from 1 unit per 5 acres to 1 unit per 25 acres. They could sell that to areas in the down part of the county, and they could then use the extra density to build developments in the lower part of the county. Once the transfer of development right was what they call serialized or created, and then sold, an easement was put on the land to mark that that has happened. The sort of premise behind all of this is these landowners have been compensated for that transfer of development right, so they shouldn't then be additionally compensated by allowing these sort of more intense uses to also occur on their property, which is why there's prohibited uses if there is an easement. So again, this is making a subtle change to that policy for the expansion of this one use. As you can see in the staff report, and I'll briefly mention here, while we are ultimately recommending support of this ZTA, it wasn't without a little bit of thought internally. One of the first things we thought of was, do cemeteries really need to be on this list of prohibited uses? And I think the most poignant thing that was brought up in that is, if there's ever a land use you cannot revert, no matter how much money you throw at the situation, how much you mend the soil, it's a burial ground. Once that is a burial ground, it is a burial ground. And so we did decide, for the sake of preserving agriculture, that fully removing cemeteries from the list was not a good recommendation. Another thing we looked at so that there was sort of parity in all of the uses on that list, should any of them be allowed to expand onto an adjacent property with a easement. There might be merit there, but I think the scope of that was sort of too big and unknown for us to study at this time, and so we decided not to make that recommendation. We also thought about, should there be standards placed on this expansion, a size limit to how much it can expand? Are there different soil types that this should be allowed on? Should there be forestry provisions, other stuff like that? We actually looked at our burial sites and found there's only about 20 of them that this would apply to. And we felt that that was a small enough envelope that even if all 20, which is doubtful, took advantage of this, it would not have a consequential change to the agricultural reserve, and therefore decided that trying to come up with standards that made sense were also more effort than it was worth here. And that's how we got to recommending approval as introduced. Staff did do a climate assessment on this ZTA. Again, very slight changes, potentially negative on greenhouse gas emissions and sequestrations, largely due to things that are hard to measure, such as, will this increase vehicle miles traveled by having more cemeteries in the ag reserve? Is this going to induce people to travel out there to them? Any potential changes in land cover? Is it more of a natural land cover that then becomes a little more formalized through a cemetery? And then conversely, there could be some very slight positive or negative changes to the adaptive capacity and resilience factors. Again, negative mainly because changes in land cover could have very localized increases of sort of climate hazards, particularly flooding risk. Positive changes could be that there's better community connectiveness and cohesiveness by allowing these sort of historic cemeteries to expand in place. So very minor, kind of saw it as a wash on climate impacts. So in conclusion, staff is recommending the board transmit the memo to council supporting ZTA 2308 as introduced for the reasons that I've explained. And that concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Berbert. Do the board members have any comments or questions?
One of the things I might find useful in the zoning text amendment presentation is an example of how it's used currently, like a literal example with an explanation, like a story, facts, and then what could potentially happen in the best possible case scenario. And so when we're changing it, we understand why we're changing it, and you give rationale for the change, but giving an example of the change and how it could possibly be used would be very informative for me as well as the public. Thanks.
Any other comments or questions? So, yeah, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate the research your staff did into, the pros and cons of each option. Yes, I think it's important, I believe, given the minimal risks for this existing cemetery to expand. But one question I did have out of curiosity, where can cemeteries go in the county by right? Just out of curiosity, and is that, and are there enough places? So I don't know if you can address that, or you can get back to me, but I just out of curiosity.
Yeah, we could quickly, if one of my colleagues quickly pull up the use table, because I don't recall off the top of my head. I do know, I believe they're allowed at least through limited or conditional use standards in mini zones. They are allowed in the AR zone under conditional use. You can do new cemeteries, and we've seen applications come in for new cemeteries in the AR zone just on land that doesn't have a TDR encumbered easement on it. Give us 1 second.
That's not going to change how we're voting, but if you can get back to, just out of curiosity, okay? So if there are no other comments or questions, is there a motion to recommend transmitting the ZTA to the district council?
Yeah, I move that we transmit comments on ZTA 23-08, transferable development rights cemetery to the council.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. Thank you so much. And we'll, do we need to take a 2-minute break because Mr. Berber is? Oh, here she is here. We can, okay. We'll just take a 1-minute break and we'll go, and we'll start again. Thank you. Sorry. Good morning. We're now on item number 7, zoning and text amendment number ZTA 2309, farming incidental outdoor stays, where staff is recommending transmittal of comments to the district council. Good morning, and Mr. Burbert will present this, and we present this item. Thank you.
All right, thank you. For the record, Ben Burbert with Countywide Planning and Policy. I'm pleased to present you with an even simpler ZTA. ZTA 2309, farming incidental outdoor stays. So staff does have a lot of recommendations with this ZTA. There are sort of a lot of moving parts. As a summary, staff is recommending the board transmit a memo to the council that's in support of the concept of the incidental outdoor stays. But we do have a few recommended amendments. They include retaining the 10% limit on agritourism, actually defining the use incidental outdoor stay, prohibiting all plumbing within individual structures that are used for the dwellings, coming up with a limit that either limits the structure occupancy or the structure size of each unit that allows a stay, clarify what is meant by the 4-day per week limitation, setting minimum farm area and maximum site areas, establishing 100-foot setbacks for the use, prohibiting development on land currently used by food production or on Category 1 or 2 soils, and that the incidental outdoor stays should be shifted as an accessory agricultural use rather than embedded within the definition of farming. And we will walk through all of this and a little bit more. So as a background, this ZTA was introduced November 7th, 2023 by Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez and co-sponsored by now President Friedson and Council members Glass and Sales. A public hearing is scheduled at the council on January 16th, 2024. And broadly, this ZTA amends the definition of farming by removing the 10% structure limitations for agritourism uses, including a new use type of incidental outdoor stay, and establishing use standards and implementation standards for incidental outdoor stays. One of the things that we do want to just sort of briefly put out there is that staff have been made aware that there's possible amendments that would be coming from one or more of the sponsors or co-sponsors on this ZTA. There are no firm commitments as to what these amendments may include, but we have heard they might include things such as requiring the structures for incidental outdoor stays to be temporary structures, that there may be limits coming to the size of each overnight stay structure itself, and that there may be consideration around minimum lot or property size that the use can occur on. Staff already has recommendations sort of formulated for 2 of those, and we will get into that as we continue through the presentation. Again, to go through the ZTA as it was actually introduced, the first thing here is a change to subsection F under the definition of farming. This is sort of the definition that establishes the idea of agritourism and what agritourism is. So it does one thing, it adds incidental outdoor stays as part of agritourism. And then you can see in the sort of red bracketed area, this is where it was removing the 10% limit on how much of agricultural structures can be used towards agritourism uses. The next thing that the ZTA does is right below that in code, it creates G, which is the sort of new use standard section that would apply for incidental outdoor stays, including the provisions that sort of agritourism needs to be part of the farm's existing operation for it to have incidental outdoor stays, that the outdoor stays must be in separate structures from the primary residence, that no cooking facilities will be permitted in the same structures as a sleeping quarter, that the maximum number of structures for stays is 10, the maximum number of occupants per structure 18 or older is 2, and that incidental outdoor stays are permitted a maximum of 4 days per week. There are a couple of other, pardon the pun, incidental changes that occur in the zoning ordinance. There are some sections that talk about accessory structures and set sort of limitations on the size and scope of these structures. One of them under 59374 for accessory miscellaneous uses. This is adding the provision ensuring that incidental outdoor stay buildings do not have to follow the size restrictions above, that they cannot exceed 50% of the footprint of the principal building. And then exact same provision is also added under the agricultural reserve zones standard method development table. Also exempting a structure being used as an incidental outdoor stay from the 50% footprint provision. So now staff's going to go through some of the recommendations that we highlighted at the beginning. The first recommendation is not to remove that 10% limit on how much of the farm structures can be used towards agritourism uses. We're not really sure where or why that actually got into the ZTA. And I think, from our internal discussion, we think there could be some unintended consequences no longer defining where the upper limit for an agritourism use is and what actually keeps agritourism as sort of an accessory use to a farm. We will add that if one of the concerns was that the incidental outdoor stays may quickly add up to more than 10% of what's there, the same exemption that was applied to the two other sections of code maybe could be considered to be added here. Not really being sure why this was for removal, our recommendation is just to sort of pass along the higher comment that we don't support it, but obviously we can work with council staff if there is sort of a reason that they had in mind. Our next recommendation is to actually provide a clear definition for incidental outdoor stays in the code. I think part of why this wasn't there in the first place is that technically all of this is being put in as a subset of the definition of farming. But some of the confusion that has, I think, come from this, I call it a use for lack of a better word, is because the use really isn't defined and there's really not a clear direction or vision for what it is. And that may have been done on purpose to allow a lot of freedom, but I think it's also causing a lot of sort of confusion and sort of mixed feelings about it. And I think staff think it's pretty important that we actually do have a set definition of what incidental outdoor stays are, and that may help clarify some of the other comments or concerns with other provisions of this ZTA. I think staff has a preference that, leans a little bit on sort of the literal definition of incidental, that this really take on a very subset use to farming. It would probably have a form or feel a little bit more like camping with more rustic structures and that kind of blend in or really augment agritourism uses. But again, staff also feels like really it's up to council staff to probably properly define this term. So that was our suggestion. The next recommendation, there is a current recommendation to prohibit cooking facilities within the structures, which staff does support. Staff really thinks this probably should go further to keep the use incidental, again, using the literal term of incidental, and that plumbing facilities generally should not be in the same structure as the stays. Staff is still very open to the idea that, plumbing through some sort of shared bathhouse is very reasonable to have with this. We're just advocating that, our vision of what this use is would not have the plumbing, or really, we're talking about restroom facilities at this point, within the individual structures. And again, I think part of this speaks to the definition concern. We're trying to figure out what sets us apart from just lodging as defined by code now. And so we're trying to figure out what kind of things might actually differentiate that from just expanding lodging use in the AR zone instead. Another recommendation is finding ways to further limit the number of guests allowed in each structure. Again, I think we recognize the two adult cap seems reasonable. There were some concerns by not setting a total cap that you could have somebody that would create a series of bunkhouses that would allow 20 or 30 campers with 2 chaperones to stay in these things. And that is a very different feeling use with sort of different external factors than, a cabin with 1 or 2 bedrooms intended for an immediate family. But we also are aware it starts getting a little weird when you start trying to define families and how big they are and really actually limiting occupancy. And so our recommendation is to take the maximum square footage approach. And we put out 400 square feet when we just sort of did simple math of if you had 2 small 10 by 10 bedrooms and 1 10 by 20 sort of common living space, that's 400 square feet. That seems sort of fitting with what we envision this use to be. Thinking about additional use standards that were not covered, we did mention one is a minimum farm size. We settled on 25 acres as a minimum farm size to start with. This really is just based on the idea that you need a site area of 25 acres for one buildable lot for residential use in the ag zone. And so having a farm that at least meets the 25-acre minimum just seemed like a reasonable place to start as a recommendation for that. We did also want to look at maximum site area. I think, agriculture is the primary focus of the agricultural reserve, and we want to make sure agriculture remains the primary focus and use in the agricultural reserve. So we're proposing a 10% or 5-acre, whichever is smaller. So the idea is that farms less than 50 acres in size would just be allowed to do 10% of their property as sort of associated with this use, and then any farm larger than the 50 acres would just be capped at 5 acres. We had talked about whether this should just be a flat percentage, but at some point, if you're limited to 10 structures, it doesn't seem to benefit anything to give an exponentially growing site area to these uses. And this is, again, our attempt to make sure that agriculture still is the predominant use here. Another one staff is recommending adding to the standards is a minimum 100-foot setback of these incidental outdoor stay structures from a surrounding property. This was pulled because that is the setback that's recommended for the campground use, that campsites be kept from adjacent properties. There are a few other instances in the code where sort of uses that sort of seem a little unusual for the zone, but are allowed either by conditional or limited use, have sort of established 100-foot setbacks as sort of a grand enough buffer that it sort of mitigates almost any externality that you would have at that point. And the final recommendation that we're adding, and this one actually came out of our climate assessment, was that we think that this should be prohibited on land that have most recently been actively used for food production or on the Category 1 or Category 2 soils as defined by Department of Agriculture. Again, this partly came out of the concern that we are trying to increase local food production in our ag reserve. We're trying to use it for agricultural purposes. We don't want to start putting competing interests in there that would potentially take away from that. And so that was seen as a negative in the climate assessment, and one of the ways we think to maybe change that negative to a neutral or even a positive would be to add this prohibition on land that was used for food production or in the Category 1 and Category 2 soils.
So if you add Category 1 and Category 2 soils, how much of the area would it be limited? Is it a big area of the area that has Category 1 or 2? I don't know what you mean by that.
Sure. If this was a huge discussion point that came up as part of the ag solar discussion a couple of years ago, and it really depends on the farm. Some properties are almost all Cat 1 and Cat 2 soils, and some have none. It kind of looks like a kaleidoscope across the county if you were to map where those soils are. And so it would have very uneven effective restriction on property owners.
Could you explain what is Category 1 and 2? I forgot.
Sure. So soil categories, I think there's at least 5. I don't remember exactly how many there are, but they're ranked in sort of how good they are for productivity of food agriculture. And so Category 1 is considered your best soil. Category 2 is less good than 1. And it continues down the category chain all the way to at least, I believe, 5. And so this would exclude the development on sort of the 2 best of the 5 category classes of soil as a way of sort of protecting our best soils from some sort of development that would potentially degrade the land in a way that kind of takes it out of being as highly classified in the future. Another recommendation we have is, and this is a little bit of an interesting one, it's to actually move incidental outdoor stays out of the definition of farming and shift it a little bit back in the agricultural section of the code as an accessory agricultural use. There's a few reasons for this. I think the first one is, again, we're having a hard time not considering this a new use, and so that in itself makes it weird to kind of bury it into the definition of another use as part of its definition. And it's particularly because there are a whole set of use standards that apply to this. So I couldn't find anywhere else in our current zoning code where we have use standards so blatantly put into the definition of a use. The code usually defines a use, and then it has a separate use standards section. The other sort of problem that we run into is generally use standards apply when uses are deemed as either limited or conditional in the code. You don't have use standards for permitted uses because they're permitted. And so keeping incidental outdoor stays nested into the definition of farming, the first place it takes us is making farming a limited use in the ag zone, which seems like a really not good idea because the whole point of agriculture is farming. It's one way that would solve this problem, but I don't think it's a good way to solve the problem. The simpler method that, again, staff is recommending here is if we just shift all this as an accessory agricultural use, you could still leave incidental outdoor stays as a mention point in farming, maybe where they added it to the sort of definition of ag tourism, but then have the actual use defined and use standards set for it as a limited use in an accessory agricultural use section of the code. It just, in our opinion, it really cleans up the way this whole thing flows. We can keep farming as a permitted use that way. We can clearly point people who want to do this as to where to go. And so that is a sort of a big change in code that we are recommending. We did look into it. We do think this ZTA can make that recommendation as sort of part of every ZTA. There are sections of code that are noticed as being recommended for change, and you can't make changes outside of what's been recommended for change because that's not what the public was noticed on. But this generally noticed that the entire agricultural section is potentially up for change. So we do think if, the planning board and if the council wanted to pursue this, they could through this ZTA. They would not have to reintroduce the ZTA to do that. Quickly covering the climate assessment, again, a mixture of positive and negative impacts. Again, mostly we're on the slight side. Again, this could have a negative impact on greenhouse gas emissions. The uses in the agricultural reserve, it would likely cause an increase in vehicle miles traveled and probably personal vehicles because there's not a lot of great transit out there. This also could create additional carbon through embodied emissions from the development of new structures. This also would have a slight negative impact and positive impacts on the community resilience and adaptive capacity factors. Again, potentially increasing exposure to climate hazards such as flooding because of the potential land use change, but that is relatively localized and minor. But the positives could be increased economic activity, and really what I think the whole point of this is ways of actually getting people to learn more about our ag reserve and actually experience the ag reserve and go through ag tourism. That is a good positive that is actually part of this analysis. So in conclusion, I won't read through them again. Staff has our recommendations. This is the same list that should be in the staff report as to what we would like to see the planning board recommend on this ZTA. So I'm going to conclude my presentation. I do suspect there'll be a lot of comments and questions, and we are happy to work through them.
Great. Thank you so much. Before the board weighs in, we have someone here, Attorney Pat Harris, to make a presentation or give a comment, and then we'll have the board give comments after that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Harris.
Good morning, Pat Harris with Lurch Brewer. We represent a farmer with a 300-acre farm north of Poolsville who's been following this and is very interested in the zoning text amendment, and we're very supportive of it. Agritourism is a growing segment of the economy, as everyone knows, and allowing overnight stays provides an educational component to it and really ultimately promotes an appreciation of the ag reserve, which ultimately, I believe, helps promote its sustainability. We spoke to Kelly Groff, who is the president of Visit Montgomery, and she was very excited about this zoning text amendment. All you need to do is Google farm stays, and you'll see that there are many opportunities out there to stay at a farm so you can appreciate it, teach your kids about the animals, about how the crops are grown, et cetera. But you can't do that in Montgomery County. So Montgomery County is not capitalizing on one of its most important assets, which is the ag reserve. So we are very supportive of the zoning text amendment, have reviewed it. There's a number of comments or recommendations that we don't necessarily agree on, but we think they're workable, so I'm not going to focus on those. I'll just identify them really briefly. One is the setbacks. There are already setback requirements in the AR zone, so I don't think that's necessary. In terms of the max area, the 10% makes sense, so therefore I don't think there needs to be a 5-acre cap. And then in the limitation on soil types, that sounds highly restrictive, especially if you think about it. If you have a 300-acre farm and you already have a 5-acre cap, that's very little impact. And if you happen to have only soils 1 and 2, then you're totally precluded. But what I really wanted to focus on is the restriction on plumbing. And I never thought I would be in front of the planning board talking about bathrooms, but here I am. That decision seems like a qualitative decision, which is somewhat subjective and really has to do with how someone's going to experience this and doesn't go to any zoning basis. And in fact, when I think about it, I would say the preclusion on plumbing in individual units creates more of an impact because now you're requiring yet another unit for a bathhouse, or maybe 2 units, or if you have your outdoor stays not consolidated, maybe 4 additional units. So I don't think it has a basis in zoning. And I actually think that you're also precluding a portion of the population from enjoying the experience, because a lot of people don't want to go someplace if there's not a restroom. I would note that Little Bennett Campground has individual cabins, and they have bathrooms. And in fact, the county employee said, and I'm going to quote, this is on the website, "We wanted to make it easier for people to reconnect with nature. Cabins offer an option that those that want to get outdoors might want a few comforts of home." And those cabins have bathrooms. So we would encourage you to not support the prohibition on the plumbing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney Harris. Now we have, you can stay there while we finish.
Okay.
Any comments or questions from the board?
I have some comments. Mr. Berbert, that was an outstanding presentation, and it's funny that you said this zoning text amendment was less complex than the one previous, because I don't think it is. But I like your recommendations, and I like how you all are reading between the lines, forecasting the potential for what could happen, the benefits, and then also the risk for abuse. When I read this, I was envisioning Jellystone Park in western Maryland or Hagerstown, which are cabins, and then there's another park that I happen to stay at in the Eastern Shore, and it was a cabin with a restroom, and it was very rudimentary. It was like bunk beds, a cabin, and with bunks built into the side of the wall. But one of my concerns is that there's a potential for abuse, and I think you guys are seeing that also, and wanting to limit like food-producing structures. And then it could also have a negative environmental impact if you have food-producing structures there. The bathroom thing is a concern to me because I don't know how someone could get the full benefit of it and then stay overnight and then not have a bathroom. Is this going to be like a Good Sam RV park or Jellystone, or like the park that Ms. Harris mentioned? And then one of the questions I have is like, what is a structure, right? Is it permanent? Is it temporary? What kind of surfaces will a structure have? Will it be seasonal? Will it be year-round? So I really like the work that your team put into this, and I generally like the recommendations, but those are the questions and concerns that I have. But what is also important, I don't know if your client is Mr. Kiplinger, Ms. Harris, but I know he's a great landowner in the Poolesville area. But the use of their farms to, continue to produce revenue in off seasons and maximizing the farms during the in season is very interesting. I have a friend who owns a farm called Sharps Farm in Howard County, and there's always a battle as to whether or not a farmhand can have a structure on the premises and live on the premises while tending to the farm, and who can occupy those premises once those premises are permanent. And so what I could envision happening is that this will eventually be abused, and if it's abused, who will enforce or restrict its abuse? But all in all, I think this is an opportunity where farmers have a chance to recognize revenue that is not generally there and has been restricted by the designation of the agricultural zone. It's a very sensitive topic, and but I really appreciate your work because it answered a lot of questions that I had when I read through it. And so it's going to be tough to strike a balance in this, and I really appreciate your work on it. Thanks.
Sure, I appreciate that. I'll quickly hit on a couple of concerns I heard. I think when it comes to what is this going to look or feel like, that's probably the greatest unknown. And there is some benefit to letting each individual farm owner decide what experience they want. I think some of them might want to lean into it being a very rustic experience as sort of their de facto. I think there are others that are going to want to lean into this to being much more of a luxury opportunity. And I don't inherently want to think we should be trying to regulate like what level of finesse is put into the inside or the actual user experience in that way. The other sort of thing, the actual type of structure, that's another interesting choice. I mean, structure is a defined term in the code with walls and a roof.
Walls and a roof.
The idea of calling the structure temporary, I think, is a little, we haven't thought through that all the way. We don't actually have a real definition of temporary in the code. There might be an opportunity to use this to think about what that actually wants to be, and whether that has to do with how it's structurally built through a foundation or a surface it sits on, whether it has to do with the amount or types of amenities or utility hookups it is or isn't allowed to have. I think all that could be built into what's considered temporary. The other thing, though, is in relying on temporary, I think with this kind of use, the structure might be something we think of as temporary, but it's not really going to be temporary. I think the idea would be you'd have it for multiple years and seasons and keep using it. So I think a little thought needs to be given further on to what exactly that temporary nature is. But I think as it's defined, it could be somebody that goes all the way and pours footings and foundation for the structure. And I think it could be people that actually pull in sort of, I'll call them a nice camping like trailer situation and putting it down. And I think the way it's written, all of that is a possible option. I know the idea of the bathrooms in the facility is probably one of the touchier subjects with this. I think it really gets down to a level of what we're expecting and what incidental is. And so, as was pointed out, our own park system has, what they consider rustic cabins, and they do have restrooms inside. They're more rustic just because there's not as many creature comforts sort of filling the rest of the cabin, but it does have the restrooms. I've been at lots of parks, state parks and other county parks in other counties that have cabins that don't have restrooms.
I think Tuckahoe State Park is where I stayed, and they had cabins with like a heating or AC unit and bunk beds built into the wall, but then they had a central bathroom
Yes.
that everyone had to go to.
And I think that's the vision that staff sort of had when reading incidental outdoor stays, is the more the route it would take. And so I think that's our recommendation, again, lacking a better definition for the use as a whole. But I think we're aware this is a big discussion item, and, I think we're very cognizant that it could limit a lot of people who would want to stay if they don't have access to that amenity. And so I don't want to say that we're inflexible on this either, but it's our best and first recommendation as to sort of where the scope of this would be.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like some other opportunity
Yeah.
for others to
I-
weigh in.
I really believe, I know how important the bathroom is. I work with the Parks Department, and it takes, we want to encourage people to go there. Not having the bathroom, I know it's going to discourage me. I'm not going to go a place that, especially a lot of people that have to get up in the middle of the night and use the bathroom when it is dark, and you're asking them that to go out there. I understand having cooking not to be done there, and that's not a big deal. But I really would believe that if we want to have this to do the intended purpose, it should have a bathroom. And also, it saves, someone may just want to have 3 or 4 of these. For 3 or 4 of these, you don't want to create a central bathroom. It's going to be more costly to do. So that's one I support, to put the bathroom back. And in regard to category 1 and 2 of soils, I understand what you are thinking, but I think, again, that's farming. We want to encourage people to come where there is farming, and we want them to see how the farming is there and participate. You want to have kids to come there and participate. Maybe they have an open farming there that kids can come and do. Unless that we see how much restriction, because I don't have a visual map to see that how much of area in a park, in a farm is going to take away. But it may take away a best location that is next to a farm that people can come have tell and show and tell to do that.
Mr. Hedrick?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on a couple of the recommendations. I honestly, I appreciate the effort with staff going from sort of like trying to define incidental and trying to put limits and strictures on that. But honestly, I think that we should, if we're going to go this route and sort of try to expand the agritourism, that we do it as broadly as possible. I honestly would argue to strike, like, if we don't want to retain the 10%, let's not retain the 10% agritourism. I mean, if that's the best use of the property, go for it, in my opinion. Same with the minimum size, minimum site areas. I would try to make this as expansive and flexible as possible. With that, including the plumbing, not restricting development on the soils, or, I understand the food production one, but quite honestly, there's 1.1 people in the county. We're not feeding them based on the ag reserve. It's important, it's good, there's an economic benefit to it, but to the extent that there's an environmental impact, I don't think that's really coming at it. I would try to limit. The 4 days per week, I think, is already in there. You're just asking to clarify that piece within the structure. I don't think the minimum farm area and maximum site area size is necessary. I don't think the 10% restriction is necessary. I would go for allowing plumbing and cooking facilities, honestly, if people want to make this as the idea to make this as economically viable and flexible as possible to actually produce this, and that includes the setback requirements, which I think we already have in the ag reserve. So I would argue that we focus mainly on the definition, and then allowing as much expansive ability to do this and produce this as possible, so that it is a viable economic option to do this, so that we don't end up with having farms that are restricted because of the soil types that are there, and sort of leave that within the realm of economics. I would limit our comments on sort of increasing the restricted ability within this ETA.
Okay, so thank you for your comments. Do you have any comments?
Do we have a general sense of, like, approximately, and if you need to get back to us, that's fine, but like approximately how many farms would be mostly or all encumbered by the type 1, type 2 soil restriction? How many properties would that sort of exclude as a share of everything in the ag reserve?
Yeah.
I know we have, and I think Patrick has handy, some of the analysis that was done as part of the ag solar, and it is fairly restrictive, although I think the number you have is based on also where there's 15 contiguous acres, I thought, when it was done for ag solar and all of its limitations, some of which are not here, but a lot of them are, it did bring it down to about 1,600 acres, but I believe that also was looking at for contiguous, I think,
Pieces.
15-acre blocks so that you could actually site solar. So I don't think it's quite as clean to say that there's only 1,600 acres that aren't in Cat 1 or Cat 2. There was 1,600 acres that weren't in Cat 1, Cat 2 that could also accommodate solar. So
Yeah.
So
it's-
big enough tracks that weren't 2, 1, or 2 tracks, so they're.
Yeah.
there
Yeah, I
could be
think
more
if you
services.
really look at it, it looks like a child's paint-by-number kaleidoscope on the solar
Sure,
map.
yeah.
And so it is a little,
So in this case, we could probably assume, needing much smaller kind of pad sites almost, or spaces to fit these in, that reasonable to assume kind of more would be available given for these particular uses than for kind of a solar array.
yes, but I'm not going to pretend it's not still restrictive, but I
Yeah.
think it's not
Yeah.
as restrictive as the solar one turned out to be.
Yeah. I think there's, can I jump in, Josh, for a second?
Yeah, yeah.
Along those lines, I think I understand the wanting to limit to the most productive soils and things like that. I think, I lean toward more the land for food production. I don't want to see anybody bulldozing, apple trees or something to put up this kind of situation. But if there's a currently unused portion or a currently unleased or non-productive, I think that's a reasonable thing to allow within that structure.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
you can go ahead, and I want to make, and then we can finish
Sure.
up here. Okay.
Sure. I just wanted to clarify too. So one on the recommendation to prohibit plumbing to these structures, these things that are going to allow these overnight stays. We weren't suggesting there wouldn't be bathrooms at all. It would be more of a community facility, similar to what we have in some of our parks facilities. Again, trying to maintain, preserve the water, which is a precious resource, to support the primary use in the ag reserve, which would be agriculture. And again, I respect what you're saying, trying to make this as economically viable as possible accessory use to agriculture. But again, that's where the primary focus of our recommendations is ensuring that agriculture remains the primary use and that the resources in the ag reserve support the primary use, and that perhaps some of the level that this could expand to would be more appropriate in other areas of the county, not in the ag reserve. So that's the basis of where these recommendations from staff are coming from. I hope that clarifies some things for you.
I think that's a great comment. If there was an established requisite that there be some farming activity or food growing that must continue to happen in order for them to have these dwellings or these temporary units, I think that's essential, because what I could see is farmers are very savvy businessmen, right? So if you give them an opportunity to, say, build a good sand park or a Jellystone park that's like cabin oriented, and they figure out a way to maximize the use of those, and then they stop growing food because you can build these structures and forget about it, and the maintenance costs, the turnover, the labor is less. So you could have a situation where they find a way to build these, and they're permanent, they have plumbing, could possibly be used for temporary long-term housing, right? 4 days a week, they can get around it. But if you don't have it directly connected to their farming activity, I think you could run the risk of them finding a way to utilize the land solely for the purpose of agritourism and not for agricultural food production or some kind of raw material production.
Yeah, so
Can I clarify one thing?
Okay.
The zoning text amendment as written limits it to 10 units. So you're never going to have a situation where someone's going to decide, okay, my sole resource is going to be providing these units at the jeopardy of farming. I mean, they're farmers, and the priority is going to be making sure they have enough order to farm. This is just incidental to the primary use.
There's
Great,
a
thank you.
structure limit
Thank you.
already, yeah.
So let me summarize some things and give you my thoughts. So I appreciate the staff, thinking through this very intentionally, and I like your analysis, well thought out analysis. I do feel that there should be some flexibility, more flexibility in the ZTA, and I feel that plumbing, to give the flexibility of plumbing, it's only, if the people want to put it in, they do. If they don't, it's only 10 units, maximum 10 units, right? And the other piece, I think we're struggling with this because we have no vision for what it could be. So that's why, it's like, what does it look like? We have no sense of what this is for, right? And so that's why it's hard. 4 days a week, well, why four, so what I would, and then the soil piece, isn't it 90,000, how many thousands acres in the ag reserve? How many acres?
Yeah, it's a 93,000 acre ag reserve.
93,000 acre ag reserve. And if it is limited to only 5 acres, just say whatever, 10% of whatever maximum 5 acres, I don't personally think that it would be a big issue on the ag reserve to have 5 acres that are in type 1 or type 2 soils. And even if it's like, say a farm had a type 3 soil, this is my thought, if it's on the side somewhere, you may end up putting more roads and, to get to that, type 3 area. So I am okay with retain the 10% limit on agritourism and so therefore but maximum of 5 acres. And if that is the case, then I don't personally feel that prohibiting on food production or category 1 and 2 soils we can take that out. So I think flexibility is important. I think it's okay for to have plumbing because that would open it up to people that may need, as you said, may need plumbing in their unit, a bathroom and stuff like that, and then we'll see how, over time, what happens and see how many are built and go from there. I think that would be my recommendation.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add one more thing. Want to really underscore and highlight the importance of the 1980 plan, the Ag and Rural Open Space Plan, TDR program that followed, the BLT program that followed. Again, we're trying to preserve agriculture as the primary use. A lot of those programs were set up to preserve that area and not encourage rooftops. We wanted to take housing units and shift them elsewhere. The closer we get to adding plumbing, to adding the unit, it becomes to feel like a dwelling, and it was, again, those programs were set up with the intent of having uses like that elsewhere. So, again, I'm just saying, from a staff perspective, that's why we put forward some of the recommendations we did.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up. I appreciate you bringing this up. But given it seems as if tell me if I'm wrong, it's limited to 10 structures, correct? It's 4 days a week, a maximum 4 days a week someone could use it, right? It's not like someone's...
Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry, if I could. So for the record, Planning Director Jason Sartori. So the way that the ZTA is currently written, yes, it's limited to 10 structures, but it does not limit the size of those structures. Is that correct? No. And it also, it's unclear what the 4 days means. Whether the use can be for 4 days, someone can only stay there for 4 days. So there's some clarity that needs to be done in that regard. But I don't think there are limits right now on the size of those structures. Is that right?
No, and so just forgive me, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to highlight the things that I think the most consensus has occurred to not transmit, because ultimately we've got to come up with a list that we are transmitting.
right.
So forgive me with the highlighting. I'm sensing there is general support to clarify what was meant by the 4 days. I haven't heard whether there's support generally or not to recommend the structure size limit.
I think so. I think I'm okay if you take these 2 yellow. I'm fine to support you with the rest of the stuff there. I agree that it should be a size limit because of what we want to make sure the integrity of the, the ag reserve to be done there. But if we take the plumbing and development for category 1 and 2, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I can go with that.
I would, I understand the desire to limit to not being a robber baron's hunting lodge, like that's the limit we don't want. But I don't know if the 10 by 10 is like the 10 by 10, structures, 10 by 10 for the resident, 10 by 10 for where the dormitory structure, or I forget what it is, sleeping, wherever. Yeah, 400 square feet. I want to allow as much flexibility with that as possible to provide, what they think folks would like to have. I mean, like I said, we don't want giant hunting lodge, but I'm not sure if that's
But
too
how do you
restrictive.
stop it? How do you stop it? If you don't put the minimum or maximum size,
There-
how could you stop it?
But there's no other structure limits within the AR, within the ag reserve at the moment. There's no other structure size limits, or there are limits to the square footage that it can cover relative to the primary residence, right?
I think so. I mean, that the 10%
Yeah.
refers to the to the area of the
To the area of
structures.
the thing. So we have a 10% limit on the amount of structured area that could totally be covered by, and I realize that the square footage of a place and the square footage of a house, different things. But we have limits in there. How much we want to ratchet down those limits is sort of where we're at to a certain extent. And being stuck inside with 3 kids in 400 square foot structures is the whole thing that gets me. And so where. And no bathroom. And no bathroom. But where do we allow for flexibility or to an upper limit which allows the production of a variety of enough things to actually make this unit, or this use viable, and units produced that make this use viable for the broadest range of folks that do not get us into, I've managed to put a giant hunting lodge on my pasture. That is, I would like to see us be as broadly open to that as possible without getting to mansion-style size with the house. That I understand there's a limit. We don't want to see 10 of those pop up.
Yeah, but 400 is 20 by 20. If you are a couple with 3 children, I'm trying to see, you have the children. My children are grown. That's not big enough.
I want them more than 400 square feet away from me. That's not true, but.
You're going to be outside all day.
They'll be outside all day anyway.
400 square feet's the size of a hotel room.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a hotel room.
Awesome.
And
That's
so-
meaning that I don't think, to the point that Commissioner Hendrick said, that's very, very tight. If you have 3 kids in there and it's a rainy day and no bathroom.
No. And that also comes to sort of the minimum farm size and the minimum farm area that I'd like us to take a look at too. 25 acres is both quite large and then not, all that much. I want us to be as accommodating as possible within the restrictions of the ag reserve, to the extent that if you've got more than that and I find and I think part of the thing is I think that agritourism is an agricultural use at this point. Due to a lot of things, not the least of which being consolidation in the agricultural industry. I think it should qualify as a more full use within an ag reserve, but that's sort of a different, a larger question. But the setbacks, the minimum farm area, the minimum site size, I understand the reasons for it within, trying to retain the character, but I think that offering an opportunity to be as broad as possible within the existing strictures to allow this to actually be an economically viable option is something we need to take a look at.
So, in order to move this forward, you had a question, we need to move this forward.
No, I was maybe just going to suggest a potential compromise on maybe, just as an example, if we want to provide more flexibility for the structure size, but we retain kind of the percentage limit, which applies to sort of the square footage of what's being used here relative to the square footage of structures being used for agriculture, right? That's the percentage limit. So maybe retain the percentage limit, but remove the cap on the structure size, just to allow for more flexibility. And maybe to Chair Harris's point, whether or not the 10% limit is the right limit, because this is the first time we're kind of moving into this area. I'm not sure how kind of adjacent jurisdictions or other counties with similar farmland areas treat this in their code, so it'd be interesting to find that out. But as a kind of early entree into this, I think the 10% limit, just to sort of see how is it playing out, how are farms of different sizes using this, what kind of experience are they looking for, and kind of are they bumping up against a limit that is kind of preventing them from realizing the full potential. I personally don't have a problem with kind of using this as a first step. I'm not sure how others feel about that, but
What
at a minimum.
if we provide an exemption? I hear what you guys are saying, but if we put the 400 square foot at the maximum, but allow for exemption, if someone wants to have a bigger size for gym, they can come and get an exemption.
Yeah.
And if we provide that, we say that what is our goal, but in certain cases, we could exempt them from that requirement as long as they stay within 10%.
I want to touch on that just for a second. So right now, if there's an ag or an accessory ag use, there is no square footage restriction on that. So that, I mean, you got to think barns and, associated ag uses. So there's not currently that restriction. There is a restriction to 10% of the entire site area for those structures, for those uses. So the 10% would be consistent with that. Again, we were trying to make sure that these were smaller, truly accessory, because leaving it wide open, again, in our minds, the worst case scenario, these could become quite large
They would.
structures. So that was where, again, the recommendation was coming from on creating a smaller.
Yeah, I understand that. That's what I'm suggesting, that from my point of view, if you want to keep the 400, that's fine, but allow people that they have better reason to get an exemption. They have to come and under certain requirements, they have to come to planning board and we could exempt them.
But to the extent that you want some sort of dormitory structure, right? Like you have multiple dormitory structures, you have a communal bath and kitchen facilities, you may have a structure that's quite large if you want to go up to 10,
That's true.
And so that structure could be fairly large, but could be underneath a certain intent, like usage. I mean, the individual rooms themselves could be 400, 20 by 20, somewhere along those lines, and then it could be a single structure. That's the reason I think I was trying to look for the reasonable upper limit on how intense the use can be is the goal, right? And I support that. I just don't want us to limit, like a 400 square foot, which is a fairly small thing. I want it to be as flexible and open as to accommodate a variety of options to.
Can I?
And I mean, if it's full enough that people are out there,
text amendment-
there's enough demand. Sorry, Brenda, go ahead.
The text amendment limits, it says occupants of over 18 is limited to 2. So
Yeah, it's gonna
hopefully
be-
that eliminates the concern about the hunting lodge. I mean, it's intended for families.
Right.
Well, yeah, and I would say, I think we are not intending to have something that's like a dormitory here, all right? That's, yeah. The other thing is,
That would technically be allowable unless, that would technically be allowable unless we instituted something like the 400.
Yes,
that
and
splits
that's
the
why we
structures
wanna
into
have
this one thing.
Yeah, that's why I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, so, there are some other things on here that, the goal was just to be relatively small, right? But family size, and so I think there's those things in here. So I'm okay, I think we've opened it up for flexibility by having the plumbing. I think we've opened up for flexibility maybe at least on the site by putting on whatever soils they are, because it's a small property, right? And I don't know if we got any other have we gotten in?
I have one final attempt and flexibility on the 400. What if the average structure size is 400, and so some could be 550, and others could be 250 or 3, and
Oh, yeah.
that's flexibility. You could have a couple little one-bedroom chalets, and you could have a larger 500 or 600
Yeah.
square foot thing.
I really like that idea.
I think that's a reasonable way to do it. If a 10 structure times 400 square feet,
like
the square
Yeah.
footage overall must be X around. I think that's reasonable. I'll go slightly higher than 400 square feet, but I'm not going to beat a dead horse.
I thought there was
Okay.
something that read that the structures couldn't be had to be a percentage of the size of the primary structure or dwelling unit on the property. Did I read that somewhere or see that in the slides?
So they are specifically exempting
Yeah.
the requirement because it's a cumulative, and so they're exempting them from the cumulative requirement that these accessory structures can't exceed 50% of the primary, which would be the farmhouse if they had one. But as Patrick had said, the truly accessory structures like your barns or your milking parlors or stuff are exempt anyway. And so then you have that 10% limit that says 10% of the site for agritourism, including 10% of structure on the site. So you have your big barns, 10% of whatever combination of that can get carved up and used for this, which I almost think in itself could be actually very restricting for small, medium-sized farms. They might not have a lot of space left, which is why I think we set out there, like, you might actually still want to exempt this use from that, but let's not remove it generally, because it could cause other problems. And again, that's where I'm trying to come up with this average idea, which had some traction, at least it sounds like.
So, Mr. Berbert, I think let's summarize here and see if we can move this forward. So, so I would recommend approving what staff had recommended with the exceptions of removing the item on prohibiting the plumbing, including on the limit the size structures to an average of 400 square feet.
Cumulative of 10, whatever,
yeah,
something like
whatever. Yeah, is the cumulative average per structure, whatever the average, it'd be 400 square feet or less, and then take out the prohibit development land used for food production on class 1 and 2 soils.
Do you want me to do a move? I move to approve a staff recommendation by remove all the prohibition of plumbing and adding the average square foot of 400, and also by removing the prohibition on development on category 1 and 2 soils.
Can we also?
Can I was going to ask for clarity on the agritourism, the 10% limit. So do we want to maintain that 10% limit
Yes.
overall? Do we want to exempt this particular use? Recommend exempting this particular use from that limit?
No, but I thought it was 10% limit up to but the maximum of 5 acres. Was that the?
I think whichever is smaller.
Whichever
Yeah.
is smaller.
Right.
Right, that's what,
Yeah.
I'm approving what you had.
So that's for the square footage of where the use could go on the
Right,
site. I think what Director Sartori is asking is, in the current prohibition of agritourism can't be more than 10%.
Overall of.
This would start counting against that, and again, staff's having to guess here because there wasn't a clear intent that council staff may have removed that 10% because there was concern that incidental outdoor stays would quickly push a farm over that 10%.
Yeah.
And I think staff's
yeah.
deep opinion is we actually are okay with that. We want the rest of agritourism to still be limited to the 10%.
That's exempting this
Yeah.
from the 10. I'm good with.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
To remove that one, if you yellow that.
Yeah.
Oh, if you yellow that, so do I have to say everything again, or I could say that exempt the incidental from 10%?
Yeah, because they may already be at 10% for
Yes.
something else.
And this would allow for the
Oh,
use.
okay,
Yes.
great.
It's not extra.
So
Correct.
you're amending the motion to also add exempt incidental from 10%.
Yes. Do I need to say it again, or this is good?
Nah, we keep track
Just take
of
a
Thank
everything.
you.
screenshot of the PowerPoint.
May I ask two other questions on this, on the 100-foot set? I unmuted Mitra and I muted myself. Are we retaining the 100-foot setbacks? Because we do have a setback requirement already in the AR, in the ag reserve, correct?
What is that setback? And
I believe it's 50 feet now.
Okay.
I still think we think the 100 feet's appropriate. We are adding we are adding sort of overnight uses, potentially up to 10 of them, to a property that didn't have it before. And, I think I'm trying to be fair to a neighbor that might
I'm
have
fine
lived
with
there or other
I'll let
smoke
it.
travels, noise travels. I'm just trying to be sensitive to that. with-
Yep, some screening and some other.
Without the
things,
food production in the category 1 and 2 soils, I think it makes a lot more sense to increase that for that. I am okay with that. And then the other one to amend, and you can kick me in a second, Mitra, after I just clarify this one. The minimum farm area is recommending a 5-acre minimum farm size and a maximum of 5 acres overall. Is that right?
25?
25 acre.
25 acres is the top
farm,
max, I think.
And either 10% or 5 acre of that site area, whichever's smaller.
All right.
Just out of curiosity, how many farms approximately kind of fall under the 25 acre number?
No idea.
Just to clarify before, if you have an answer to that, I think what we're saying is a 25-acre minimum.
Minimum.
For the farm is 25 acre minimum, so yeah.
Right, so you need to be larger than
I
20.
yeah, that concerns me on size, but I don't know how many we have that are under 25 that, I mean, do you have a viable farm option at this point in Montgomery County that's under 25 acres that's actually, it's very small?
Actually, there are farm fields that are less than 25
Well, there are less than 25, but they're
What's
not.
the, could you clarify the concern?
Feet
I
family.
understand that the minimum lot size for kind of, I guess, a dwelling unit is 25, but is there a specific environmental or other concern?
I think our concern is once you start getting to less than 25 acres, and I think this is part of the premise is why 25 acres was picked in the 1980s for the new tract size, that was sort of seen as the minimum lot size that you could do a house with improvements on a few acres and still have farming, and I understand there are definitely smaller farms in that. I think the concern we have is if you have a 10-acre farm, to now find room for up to 10 of these, you really are taking a lot of the farm out to basically just become a small boutique hotel at that point. And so that's sort of our nexus, is 25 acres has sort of been established as sort of the minimum viable farm size by creating the 25-acre lot size in the 80s. It was a good starting point for us to work on.
That makes sense, except I'm wondering if, I mean, if we consider 25 acres to be minimally viable for farming in general, I mean, wouldn't we consider this to be sort of a necessary or a real value add for farms of a lower size in particular if they can't sort of maximize their farm potential if they are a smaller farm?
I mean, the answer would be sure. I just think we're no longer in the definition of farming. We're hoteling, I think, if you're doing that, which is I think we could have that debate. I just feel like that's not the use that's been presented to us, and that's why we haven't gone there.
And just so we do have some data that was included in the agritourism study a while back now. Just so we're clear, as of 2017, there were a little over 100 farms in Montgomery County that were less than 10 acres. There were a few hundred farms that were between 10 and 49 acres, and then there was about 150 or more farms that were greater than 50 acres in size. And as the ag reserve, as that area over time becomes a little more and a little more increasingly fragmented, you can imagine that the size of farms in general is shrinking while the number of smaller farms is growing. So it's a general trend, but that, to answer your questions on the number and size of farms, those are approximate numbers. As of 2017, we're about to get an update from the 22 numbers that we should have any time now and be able to update that and give you an idea of where the trend is heading. We suspect in the same direction.
Okay, so I think if you're all good, we're ready. So, so the recommendation is, I think it stays the same. Nothing changes. We never had a second on this recommendation.
I'll second.
All right, all right.
A third.
You were turned on, you get it.
The kick worked.
Yeah. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. Thank you. Thank you. And, is there clarity on what we just voted on? Just, okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I look at Rachel and she shakes her head, so the answer is yes.
All right. So we're going to take just a 2-minute break, and we're going to go to one that I'm sure Mr. Berbert's going to say is more simple than the last one. It's number 8, which is zoning text amendment ZTA 2310, parking, queuing, and loading, calculation of required public parking. Thank you. We're live now. So good afternoon. We're on item number 8, zoning text amendment ZTA 23-10, parking, queuing, and loading, calculation of required parking, where staff is recommending transmitting comments to the district council. And we have Mr. Burbert from the planning staff presenting this ZTA. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I tried to save the hardest for last.
Okay.
So again, Ben Burbert with the Montgomery County Planning Department, Countywide Planning and Policy. Before you, we're going to discuss ZTA 2310, parking, queuing, and loading, calculation of required parking. I don't know who names these things. Staff is recommending the planning board transmit a memo to the district council that supports ZTA 2310 with a couple of recommendations. The first one is, I think, something that staff has caught that we think needs to be modified to make sure the intent of the ZTA can be fully achieved by modifying a subsection in code we'll discuss later. We broadly want to redefine BRT stations as non-rail transitway stations, and we'll explain why for that in a moment. And we have a little bit of concerns over parking lot districts and what this may or may not do to them. I think here we're just asking the board to transmit that there are concerns. I don't think we have solutions. They're not really our purview to solve, but we are aware there's a concern there. This ZTA was introduced on November 28th by now Council President Friedson and Council members Glass and Mink. The entire council has since co-sponsored this ZTA. It's going for a public hearing January 16th, 2024. And again, this adjusts the vehicle parking allowed for residential projects that are within certain distances of defined transit systems to no longer have to provide the baseline minimum parking. One of the big reasons that council had introduced this ZTA was hopefully to help the affordable housing or housing affordability and production in general. Parking is expensive. It's not $70,000 a space when you're doing above grade parking, but it can get that expensive when below grade, and that's really what we push for near our metro stations to maximize what can happen above grade. And again, we're also, just as a planning department, generally looking for ways that we can reduce car dependency and create more places for people and less places for vehicles. And sort of the benefit of this ZTA is it continues on the existing market-based approach that we have, where a developer ultimately can decide how much parking their project needs, except currently, to get less than sort of that baseline minimum, there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through. This would just make it a lot easier to provide less parking if you determine your project doesn't need it. If you think your project does need it, you can come and ask the board to provide more parking. And this doesn't inherently retroactively change the requirements. This doesn't also stop somebody from coming in and doing a site plan amendment to maybe amend the site plan to say that we want less of the parking to count towards us. Maybe they could then lease it to a neighboring project who wants to then use some of the spaces. But all that kind of stuff would have to come back to the board because right now everybody has agreements for how much parking is associated with their project. So again, as introduced, there is a section in the parking set part of the code that's called adjustment to vehicle parking, and that's kind of where all the other things that applicants use now to reduce parking live. This would add a new 8 parking minimum near transit, and it would exempt, as I said, residential uses from those parking minimums within a half mile of a metro station, a half mile of a Purple Line station, or a quarter mile, and as introduced, of a bus rapid transit station that's either existing or has been funded for construction in the 6-year CIP at the time of application.
So this is just residential, it's not for mixed use? Because we don't have residential that much. Everything is mixed use.
The way I would interpret that is the residential part of the building would not have to provide parking, but if the commercial ground floor or floors required parking, they would still have to provide or use other mechanisms that they currently can by code to remove that parking. So, right, if it's a the building across the street that has ground floor commercial and residential above, the residential could go to 0, but the few spaces that commercial would still require either need to be provided or bought out through the parking lot district.
Okay, so it still counts even though that is a mixed use. Okay, got it. I didn't know. Thanks.
So in the code now, there's a lot of ways that applicants can reduce their parking. There are abilities to reduce parking standards for affordable housing, age-restricted housing. Certain religious assembly can apply for parking reductions. Making your parking available as sort of shared parking in a mixed-use environment, you can reduce total parking. Providing car share spaces allows you to reduce parking. Unbundling parking from leases is a common one we see where you can reduce parking for doing that. Federal agencies have their own parking ratios. And then you have your parking lot districts, downtown Silver Spring, downtown Bethesda, Montgomery Hills, and here in Wheaton, where you can just pay an annual tax and not provide any parking, and that goes to help maintain the public garage and parking systems. And then there's the ability to just ask for a parking waiver. In the past 10 years, we've had at least 10 projects in the county that have used one or many of these combined to reduce parking below the baseline minimum. The one thing they all kind of did have in common is they were near our metro stations. So it's sort of painting the picture as to why this ZTA is sort of the next evolution of this. Again, we talked about the 4 parking lot districts before. I think the concern.
Can I just ask one, excuse me?
Sure.
So the PLD's parking lot district, so if you're in a parking lot district, you don't have to provide parking, but you have to pay into that fee.
Correct.
Right.
So you're assessed an annual tax, basically, for not providing the baseline minimum parking per the county's website on how the system works. And so that's really the concern I think staff could see, is that there could be a long-term funding problem if more and more projects are able to come in and not have to pay that fee. And again, it's sort of complicated because this is sort of run by DOT. It's really their thing. I am aware that, I think council's aware this could be a problem. I think there's going to be some discussions forthcoming on it. You know, we're aware that it could be a problem. I think it's a little hard to measure how big of a problem. And again, part of that's going to be based on how many applicants retroactively amend site plans to take away the parking requirement, and then that could take away the fee. I think there's.
But if they didn't, just say they said, I can get out because I'll just pay the fee. But wouldn't the people, but that's assuming the people that, you're not building the parking because you tell those folks there's a garage next door, park in the garage. Wouldn't they get their fee from the payments and the people paying to park in that garage, or?
So the county definitely charges, you can buy a monthly parking pass and park in those garages. I honestly don't know enough about the funding mechanisms and balanced budgeting of PLDs to know what percentage comes from the property sort of tax assessment versus the parking revenues. And so there might be ways of making this back. It's just not an expertise I have.
Okay, thank you.
So are you going to coordinate with DOT, or you think that the council staff will coordinate with DOT? Because I know that this is a big revenue and this is an issue for the PLDs. Is it our job to coordinate with DOT and provide response here, or is it that the DOT is going to send their comments straight to the council?
I mean, we can certainly reach out to them. I would suggest, from the purpose of commenting to council, I think they need to be their own advocate in this. It really isn't our purview. I think we can make them aware of it, and I think Mr. Cronenberg might have something to add here.
Robert Cronenberg, for the record. If I can add a little bit of clarity to that. So in Ben's right that in the PLDs, there used to be a tax, an ad valorem tax that was assessed based on the parking, kind of the delta between what you're providing and what you're not providing. You can go down to zero, but then you're paying the tax between that delta. So if you had a requirement, then you had zero, whatever was the difference you were paying. The county has not assessed that tax in many years. And so there's no tax being collected, to my knowledge at this point. And the parking garages themselves are not, they're a revenue source for the PLD and for the county, but there's not a reliance on the projects and the development in the downtowns for that revenue, specifically, for development. the way that the code is written is the parking lots or the parking garages in most cases, they're there to the tax was there to satisfy maintenance and upkeep. It was not to satisfy a parking requirement. So hopefully that provides a little clarity for you.
So getting into recommendations for the ZTA, the first one, as I mentioned earlier, in that sort of section I, the adjustments to parking, letter B under that has the current code that says that adjustments under the section to the minimum number of required parking spaces must not result in a reduction below 50% of the baseline parking minimum or shared parking model minimums. I believe this was an oversight by council to not catch that this is here. I believe the intent's to get us to zero if somebody wants to. This wouldn't without changing it, so our recommendation is to otherwise exempt section 8 below, which is the new section for near transit.
So you're basically saying this doesn't apply to anything under this near transit requirement?
Yes.
That's what essentially is making sure that that's clear.
The next one is to go into section C of the new part of the code that's relying on bus rapid transit as one of the three sort of metrics to allow you to implement the reduced parking. Defining BRT gets a little complicated. I think in the past, in the code, when we've used BRT as one of the transit options that would qualify you, like for the biohealth priority campus or the mixed income campus that we've taken forward, it always qualified around planned. And so it's a little more intuitive to say, well, we know what the planned routes and stations are, we can apply that. Now that we're dealing with existing, there was a little concern that, you know, what is BRT to one person might not be to another. And so are the improvements that they did for Flash on 29 really BRT? You know, the answer probably is yes from the county's eyes and to a lot of people, but maybe not everyone. The other thing we have is, you know, we keep planning and we keep modifying routes, we keep adding routes, changing routes. And so the kind of lowest common denominator to capture all of this change was to use non-rail transit way, because that's the new sort of defined term in the functional plan of highways and transitways. And that would also just clear up the idea that, you know, improvements of high-quality transit were made on 29, and that's a non-rail transitway, therefore those would count. So that's sort of the reason for this change. I think it doesn't, in our mind, change the intent at all. It just makes it cleaner and easier for us to implement as projects come forward in the future. Again, we did a climate assessment on this, planning staff.
Can I just ask one question? So it's any BRT station, not a.
That's existing or that is in the capital plan. So in this instance, the Flash 29 exists, and we have Veers Mill and Rockville, parts of Rockville Pike are now in the capital budget. And so we've sort of assumed those, the quarter-mile buffers around those three corridor stations would be able to start applying for this once this were approved.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So in the climate assessment prepared by planning staff, we do find that there could be slight to moderate positive impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, because this would hopefully encourage more either car light or car less households, and encourage more walking. It's a little difficult to measure how big of an impact. I think these areas are already sort of robust for that lifestyle anyway, but this will just go that much further to making that a reality. We also think there could be slight positive impacts on the community resilience and adaptive capacity, kind of for the same reasons, reducing auto dependency, creating denser places and more places that inherently community can kind of gather and help each other out in times of need. So in conclusion, staff is recommending to the board transmit that memo to district council supporting this CTA, modifying the section to exempt the parking near transit from the 50% reduction limit, and to change BRT stations to non-rail transit way, and to just acknowledge that, you know, we want to make sure that PLDs continue to function. It sounds like they may have a path they've figured out, but I think just making sure everybody's aware that that is out there. So that concludes our presentation.
I have one, I have a general comment question. Thank you for clarifying this. When I first learned of this, I thought it was going to be a mandatory reduction in parking as opposed to a permissive reduction in parking. And this is all it's about, is like allowing a developer or property owner to reduce the minimum required parking. But if they'd like to reduce the minimum required parking, they would be allowed to do so, correct? Okay, thanks.
I have a question. When I was reading the ZTA, you talked about how they decide, and you didn't make any comment about the measurement of 1/4 or half a mile. I think it's important to be inaccessible for people. You know, if they are using the transit, if you're talking the walk shed of half a mile or 1/4 mile, they should be able to walk. If we go like the way that you called it, bird view, that it just connected and there is no connection, then how do they get to their place unless that it may be a much longer distance to walk?
Yeah, I think we definitely shared that same concern. The reason we haven't made a motion here on that, it's partly because, you know, this is one of many places where we define things that can happen because of your proximity to transit or other land uses. And so to sort of address this holistically, what really wants to be added to the code is a clear definition on how you'd actually perform that measurement. And that would nicely fit in a different section of code where it sort of is like rules that apply to the whole ordinance. And because that was not introduced as part of the CTA, we can't do it now. I think what staff was hoping to hear is that this is a problem we want to address, and in the spring we could come back maybe with a ZTA that we would propose introduction of to add that section, and we could do a more robust presentation describing how is DPS doing the measurement now, what are some of the options that we could discuss as to what we would recommend it be in the future.
Okay, so can we add a recommendation that a ZTA would come in future to discuss? We need to do that. So I think that right now as it is, it puts it in limbo. It's a big limbo in my opinion. But I totally understand what you're saying, and under the conclusion, maybe we should add another bullet point that, we need another, if you believe that ZTA is the right way, we need another ZTA to define, especially if given to DPS. DPS needs a tool to know how to enforce it or how to measure it. That needs to be done.
I guess a quick question I would have, I think our thought was we would do the work and have the board be the introductor of it. Would you want me to phrase it more that we think it's needed and expect to see it from us?
Whatever
or are you okay
you
if-
like, you think is the right way. I'm just saying that it should have to be a mention that this issue is not resolved. What works for you the best, I'm fine with it, as long as it's just something pointed that we need to do this. And we cannot really enforce it until that is done.
I think, I to the point about introducing a new ZTA, kind of covering that and maybe potentially other things, I just want to say I agree that we'll probably want to continue this conversation moving forward, using this as kind of a really good building step. Thanks for bringing this and having us discuss this. I know this came from council, but this is a tremendous first step, and I just want to emphasize first step because I think that, in my view, we should try to make this parking reform as expansive as possible, ideally countywide in some form or another. It has all the positive impacts that you talked about, obviously with regard to affordable housing, reducing housing costs in general. We know that. But I think it has tremendous other potential implications as well, particularly related to our goals of mode shift and encouraging kind of less car-dependent lifestyles, as you mentioned as well. So we can talk about maybe what kind of future iterations of this might be. But I think with regard to this particular ZTA, and I guess the scope in which we're sort of operating. I have a few considerations I think that maybe we should talk about and consider. First, related to the distance thing, we'll come back to that. I think that as the crow flies, just to make it as expansive as possible, sort of the radial distance, if we are going to use a catchment area approach, I think that is preferable because it includes more potential developable properties. In addition to that, I think that we should consider adding MARC service, MARC stations, to the list of transit services. I think that we should probably be consistent with, if we're going to use a geographic scope consistent with half-mile across the board instead of using a quarter-mile for BRT, we're envisioning BRT to be really high amenity, quality service transit lines. I think people I think people will be more than willing to walk or bike or stroll or whatever the case is beyond a quarter mile to BRT stations. And on top of that, I think that we should at least consider adding other high-frequency bus routes, whether that be WMATA or Ride-On, to this list as well. Frequency can change, so I know that's perhaps hard to sort of capture in code. Also, the definition of high frequency can change. But I think that, in the interest of being as expansive as possible and knowing that service really does drive ridership, and so people will take the bus more often, be more willing to take the bus if it's a high service line. It doesn't have to be BRT. And so along stops where those high service lines exist, I think that we should consider applying or recommending applying this CTA as well. Maybe I'll stop there for now to see what the thoughts are there, but we can continue talking about other things too.
So I just have a question. So is your point is to see how to add it into the ZTA, or is it to say that you recommend staff working on a ZTA that could amend this to to can implement, or I don't know if there's some studies may need to be done, but thinking about adding near MARC stations, BRT up to a half mile, and then at WMATA bus stops if there's a high frequency of, I'm just.
I would defer to staff about what the best approach is. I hope that we could at least cover some of that in here. I know that you're using non-rail transit ways as a catch-all to allow for kind of different definitions and types. And would it be, does that include MARC potentially? If so, then maybe we don't need to specify MARC. But if it doesn't include MARC, maybe adding that in addition to non-rail transit ways. And then we can talk separately maybe about high frequency, bus and how to apply that.
Yeah, what I will say is we actually internally talked about the high-frequency bus, and for reasons I think you're expressing, we decided not to try to get it in here now, but I think we can certainly have that conversation going forward. With MARC, I think we hear you, and I think if that is the direction the full board wants to take, we can get behind that. I think in the past, we haven't included it because it is very unidirectional. You get 5 trains a day. You still kind of need a car if you live near a MARC station most of the time. Hopefully that can change at some point, and I know it becomes chicken and the egg of will it change because you've added the development? Our experience is no. That never actually unfortunately drives the investment change, but so that's why it's not here. But if that's something the board really thinks we need to start promoting, we can.
I appreciate that, and I think kind of understanding what has happened around those station areas obviously is important. But I think the relevant point here is that, we're not mandating. And so I think my preference would be to be, again, as expansive as possible. And it's not a mandate, it's just allowing what they feel like they need. And so in that sense, if they do feel like they need more around a MARC station, totally fine. But I don't think that we should be sort of differentiating necessarily. If we're going to use transit, if we're going to use proximity as the basis for this ZTA, I think it makes sense, at least in my view, to include, although it may be today relatively low service, bi-directional during the peak hours, in the future these could be really high-frequency lines, and I think that we, as a community, should be pushing for that as well. Yeah. So in the interest in being forward-looking, I would encourage including MARC stations, and hopefully many of those station areas can change in the future. And then on the high-frequency bus side, is it more complicated because we would need, would that, for example, require a separate ZTA to sort of include a definitional change?
I think if we could put it in the CTA and it would just, the definition of high-frequency bus would have to just get codified into the section and whatever the metric, whether it's, certain amount of headway during peak period or multiple lines, maybe. I think there's stuff that we'd have to figure out, and I see Dave, who's probably more of a subject expert on this than me, wants to chime in, so.
Yeah, David Ansbacher, Acting Division Chief. I think we do have some concerns with this. It is very difficult to define and therefore measure. As we know, even high-frequency bus lines can change. The stations can change. Obviously, MARC, Purple Line, Red Line, and BRT, the stations are largely fixed, so we don't have that concern with them. But then, even if the lines were to, the high-frequency bus stations were to be more fixed, I think another concern is frequency changes. Frequency can be very difficult to measure from hour to hour based on operations. Those operations change. It just gets very difficult to measure. We can continue to think about it. I'm just not sure that we're ready at this point to have to be fully behind that.
And if I could also provide a kind of a source of comparison here. About 4 or 5 years ago, the county council made changes to, through a ZTA, to our ADU, or accessory dwelling unit regulations. One of them was to exempt parking requirements for ADUs within 1 mile of MARC rail stations, Purple Line stations, and Red Line stations. So just as a point of reference of another place where they've included MARC, but also went farther in terms of the scope of that.
Yeah. I think that, sorry, I'll just say one more thing then. James, I'll turn
I'm
back
just
to
going
you.
to repeat most of what you said. That's fine.
That makes sense, the high frequency challenges, that makes sense. I think there's something to be said for kind of if we develop at scale and density in some areas, it's less likely in the future those areas will have less service, hopefully. But again, chicken and the egg. So personally, that makes sense. I'm comfortable sort of leaving that out. But it is interesting, that we've made certain decisions about kind of catchment scope in a more expansive direction, and I would actually be interested in doing that as well if we had support for that, maybe to include, suggesting up to 1 mile across the board, BRT, MARC, Metro, Purple Line. I think that's something that, again, if we're going to use geographic catchment as the proxy for having a non-car or limited car lifestyle, although I think we should maybe do this countywide in some form, I think up to 1 mile would sound good to me.
Mr. Linden, are you suggesting it be mandatory or permissive? That's
Permissive in the same sense that we see it here, where just removing the minimum requirement, so developers will be able to build what they feel is necessary. Of course, we would, for many of these, we would continue to see site plans come in, so we would have a say as well. But removing minimums, I think, is, and as we've seen around the country, as you all are, of course, well aware of, this is increasingly done in cities and urban counties, both for housing affordability and for kind of environmental sustainability reasons.
Do you have a comment?
I will go through very quickly because Josh got most of them. I would like to include MARC as part of the thing. Recommend that we include MARC trains in there. It is an endless cycle of chicken and the egg, but I would go forward looking on that, and there are places where it would be a useful thing. Again, we're doing minimum, so I would ask to include MARC. Also, as Commissioner Linden mentioned, the half-mile universal. I would take a half-mile universal, at least over those stations, including BRT. I also support a mile around it as well, if we can get 3 votes for that. Again, you talked about the measurement in there. I would still recommend the radiate to straight line measurement around as the preferred one. And I was interested in that the DPS's current version is if any part falls within, the whole part falls within, the whole plot falls within. I would recommend retaining that in whatever version we have in the future, if we recommend a future ZTA for that as well. again, with the frequent bus routes, I mean, if we tied it to something along the lines of number of routes or something like that, there's like 6 Q routes that come by my house. Like it's not so much the Q2 is better than the Q4, but they all get me where I'm kind of going. So like if we can work out something like that, I'd absolutely support us putting high frequency bus routes in there as well, either with Ride-On or WMATA. Headways and peak periods, whatever is the best option for that, because the whole purpose is moving people. And if it moves people well, given the benefit, we have the infrastructure, let's invest in the areas around that infrastructure. Also, I think this is beyond the scope of this particular ZTA, but as I mentioned, with parking requirements countywide, some ZTA that addresses the parking requirements for residential uses countywide, I think would be useful, or some recommendation from us. I think it's 2 per residential unit in most of the non-CBD. Yeah, if we are going to sort of produce a ZTA, for them to consider, I would encourage us to look at how to reduce those restrictions countywide and reduce those minimums that we have for residential uses, as we did with ADUs, reducing those. That was tied to transit geographically, but to do something where we minimize that sort of countywide to sort of encourage that sort of development that's got access and things like that. So something to consider as we move forward. And then I don't know how to best say promote or encourage or at least acknowledge that site plan amendments are possible and make that something that is notified as much as possible, or at least publicized to the extent that this is not retroactive, but site plan amendments are an option that you have. And I would like to see that sort of like publicized as much as we can, a little bit, again, beyond the scope of the ZTA specifically. And anyway, Josh caught most of my other bullet points on my notes, so I think we're good.
Yeah, thank you. So I have just a couple comments on what is MARC ridership like these days? I mean, is it, I mean, just in general, is it?
Not great. Not great.
Okay, all right.
I don't have an exact number for you, but it's not a huge player.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe 10 to 15,000 boardings sticks in my head, but it's nowhere near what Metro Rail or Ride-On are.
Then you could see the spike too when they shut the red line down several years ago, is that it has considerably more capacity than is currently being used. They shut the red line down during the summer for several months, and that was the usable infrastructure.
So my other comment is, question, what's the difference between, we talked like could a bus station be considered the same as a non-rail station? Is if it's a high frequency? I'm just trying to, will you say, so it's just assumed that the BLT station is going to be a high frequency, high connected, every station's going to,
The idea of stations are that they're defined in the master plan of highways and transitways. So if anyone in the public, staff, whoever looks at the master plan of highways and transitways, those stations are defined, or they can be added as part of a capital project by MCDOT. We don't have a standard about high frequency or number of ridership that makes a station qualify here. It's just, is it in the master plan of highways and transitways?
Okay,
Well, and those stations are stations. They're constructed as stations. They're not just bus stops, right? So that could be moved across the street or 100 feet down the road. They're built up because the curb comes up to the height of the bus entry. So there are a number of things that are established there that are more significant. So they don't move once they're built.
correct. I was just thinking, it could be that one of those stations provides no more riders than another bus stop in a urban area that moves a lot of people, but the buses just come every 5 minutes, right? I'm just trying to compare what, its impact other than it's in a master plan as a BRT, bus rapid transit station, right? I mean, its goal is to move a lot of people, but another bus stop can move just as many people, right? But it's just not a bus rapid transit station, correct?
Stations that are in the master plan of highways and transways are intended to have very high ridership.
Right.
If through analysis, we find that the ridership is going to be lower, they typically do not move forward into design and are removed from the master plan of highways and transitways. That said, it's certainly possible that there could be some local bus stops that have very high ridership that could approach, or in some instances, be higher than our lowest, our BRT stations with the lowest ridership. But again,
Right.
BRT stations and stations in the master plan and highways and transitways are intended to have very high ridership.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's go, where are we now? So it says conclusion, modify section. Can we just go through what's in each of these sections again so we can move forward with?
So I think everybody agrees with the first bullet, which is to get this provision out of being caught up in that 50% maximum reduction clause, and that's what the first bullet does. The second bullet on its own, I think, is, as everybody agrees with, we can use the master plan of highway and transitways transitway definition. Again, I think from what I'm hearing, maybe this is something we do bring back in the spring with the ZTA. We have a little more time to think about if there is a reasonable way to measure this or what this means. I don't think staff is super prepared today to figure out what the high-capacity transit looks like, but we can certainly study it further.
Yeah, I would bring it back.
So that's what's in there. What the other things that we've heard, I think there seems to be consensus to add MARC. There's still the 1 mile versus half mile. I don't think I've heard more than 2 people definitely say they would do a mile.
Put all the things, so I'm just understanding and that is 1 mile versus half mile. I think originally there was 3 measurements, a quarter for something, a half for something, and a half.
So,
go
ahead.
It was half for Metro and Purple Line and quarter for the bus transitways.
Okay. And so, right, I agree with this half mile radius. For what you said, for transit, metro, and what did you say? BRT?
Yes.
Okay.
And MARC.
You're right. And so, if someone said but my concern about MARC, and just tell me if I'm thinking of this wrong, just say there was a MARC station and nothing pretty much else around it, right? I mean, what this ZTA says, if it's that situation, if property was in, a development was a half mile away from it, then it would not have to have parking. Is that what it's saying? Just if it's a MARC alone?
Yes, if that were passed, or if that were recommended and then ultimately passed by the council and MARC were added to the list at a half mile, any residential project in any zone that's within that half mile radius would be able to not provide the parking minimums if they chose.
I just wanted to clarify my thinking behind adding MARC. It's really not, it's not as much considering what the service is today. It's sort of thinking about, like, this is built infrastructure that we have that connects to other things, like Metro, connects to Purple Line once you get down to Silver Spring. It has other connections to, I assume, different, or at least close by connections to future BRT stations. It's really imagining a future where we push the state of Maryland to, like, dramatically increase funding to improve service. So, it's more akin to sort of, like, today it's thought of as commuter rail. It's more akin to sort of like a regional rail system,
Right.
where you have, like, all day long, 2-way, pretty frequent, like every 15 to 30
Right.
minute service. And it's really, it's mostly a funding issue. Like, we're actually really fortunate to have such built infrastructure basically ready to go. It's really just a funding issue. So it's the kind of it's the kind of infrastructure where I'm really optimistic that in the future we can very quickly make big service improvements. And if so, I think having this policy in place to include that will sort of be ready to go. Like the ground will be kind of prepared and will be set.
So I'm okay with that if, how many opportunities are for the MARC connect to other rail stations? I mean, you saw it's Silver Spring. Is there other places where they can connect to?
It connects at Rockville.
Connects to Rockville?
It connects at Rockville. There's a station at Rockville that connects to the red line.
Okay, all
But
right.
I have a question in that regard. Market station may not be in the urban area, it may be in the rural areas, okay? The problem is that if you don't provide parking, that some people may need to have a car to go grocery shopping or anything else, because not other amenities are available, because they're not
Yeah.
in
And they have
the.
they have the option under this.
And I think that gets to sort of what Commissioner Barley was talking about before. It's more permissive than mandatory. It really is permissive, not mandatory. And
Okay.
I think that if developers are building in an area that's more rural, they're probably going to determine on their own that they need more parking there.
Yeah.
I've got it. Great. Okay, so, and then the 1 mile versus half mile was for what specific again? Just the,
So, I mean, there's an infinite number of ways this could go. So right now, the ZTA has the half mile for the Purple Line and the metro station and the quarter mile for the BRT. The sort of initial recommendation was, let's make them all a half mile. And then there was support from, I believe, at least 2 of the board members to actually make them all 1 mile. And I'm assuming that would also apply to MARC stations, the same, treat them all the same. So assuming we're going to add MARC to the recommendation, I feel like there is consensus there. I need to know, is the board recommending we go to a mile radius around these, or does the board want to do a half mile for all of them? Or does the board want to split, do
Okay,
a
I
mile
have a
and some? and-
question, because if it is not a walking for people to come, that 1 mile may end up to be 2 miles, depending how you measure it. So I think that this should come, changing half a mile or 1 mile should come when we are going to define how to measure it, and then see that if it is a walkable, is that, what do we mean and how we could do it? 1 mile is perfectly fine, in my opinion, if you can walk it. But if you cannot walk it, it could be 2 miles. It could be 2.5 miles, and that would be not easy for some older people to walk.
yeah, I get your point about can you really walk it? And my house is about 0.7 miles from the Tacoma Metro Station, and people can easily walk it from lots of directions, and that's people take the Metro big time. So if it were just a half mile, I mean, I think it should be more than a half mile, but I think it should be you can really truly walk.
Well, we also require the developments produce infrastructure improvements when they come in. I mean, we're going to be allowing for, with this development, if we expand it, and it does make things pencil out that would not otherwise pencil out, that includes off-site and on-site infrastructure improvements. We're producing the walkable situation that we want, and if it's not, then they build it at the parking minimums they need, and it doesn't matter. But it doesn't change anything that would otherwise be.
Right.
We
And I'll
don't
just-
require it to be 1 mile or 2 miles. If we ask them to build the infrastructure, it may be 2 miles of walking, because we don't require that. In my opinion, it all depends how you measure it. 1 mile is walkable, but if you measure it radius and there is no walking, it could be 2 or 3 miles.
I think it's a fair point, and obviously people have different needs and abilities, and so walking to some person means something different for someone else. But I think I know we don't have to dwell on this forever, but I just wanted to point out again that proximity to transit is really just one rationale for removing minimums.
Yeah.
I think that it's certainly not the only rationale, and it may not even be the most important rationale depending upon what the challenge is. Obviously, we want to encourage people to use transit, and so this is one way of promoting that particular lifestyle, but it also really relates to housing costs. And, we see around the country that some cities across the board are removing minimums citywide. Some counties, I think that are more urban, have done the same. Some states have required cities above a certain size to remove mandatory minimums across the board. So I think what we're considering here is actually kind of a limited form of reform that very much should be a starting point and not kind of the maximum constraint. And for that reason, I think we should be as expansive as possible. I think 1 mile from transit station is better than half mile, but it's not as good as countywide, which I think ultimately we should be considering countywide reform.
Yeah.
Because again, it's not saying you can't do it, it's saying we should allow people to build what they feel they need. So, for those reasons and probably others, I would support 1 mile for now. I think that this
Likewise.
deserves coming back to as part of a futures ETA with some other considerations, but I would push for 1 mile.
If I might add a comment for levity, one of the things that I think is interesting in expanding the 1 mile zone, it does give private property owners more say in the development of their real estate, and it gives them more individual control. So, you know, there's a trade-off, and I think it's positive for both sides. You potentially reduce parking, you increase the opportunity for housing, and then in turn, you also give more control back to the owner of the real estate.
Staff is fine with 1 mile. We would prefer to keep this as simple as possible because it's just easier to apply. So a 1 mile straight line distance makes sense to us. I will also say, to address some of the comments about the provision of adequate station access infrastructure, that is, of course, very important. And most of the BRT projects and the Purple Line are coming with additional infrastructure. The board saw the Beers Mill Road BRT project maybe 6 months ago. That was combined with a bicycle and pedestrian improvements project with some substantial improvements. The US 29 BRT is in effect now, but upgrades are coming both to the transitway and to the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. And the Purple Line is under construction, as we know right now, and there's a lot of work on projects as part of the Purple Line to improve walking and bicycling, but also additional projects for many of the station areas that are underway, separate from the Purple Line, that are underway right now to improve walking and bicycling. So that is coming with all of these projects.
So I just want to add one more thing, because maybe I'm one of the oldest and sitting here. And when you think about the age, people that they retire, retirement age, they downsize from the single-family houses and they want to go to the urban areas that they don't have to drive, okay? And just be able to use all the amenities very easy. So that's why that I want to make sure that for people that are 70, 75, 60, 65, that they may have some less mobility, we should make sure that the walkability is available for those ages also. If someone wants to move to one of these multi-family, that I believe many of aging communities, baby boomers, probably they're going to do that. Eventually you don't want to drive anymore, and you want to be somewhere that you have access, everything. 2 miles for someone that is at 70 or 75 is a long way until someone that is young and they can walk easily. And, right now, although I'm getting there, 2 miles is easy for me. But I know that in 5 years or so, 2 miles may be a little bit pushing it. So that's why it's important that how we measure this walking shed, that making it inclusive and accessible for all the ages. We are all young and decide that, okay, changing a quarter to half and then changing it to 1 mile, and everybody can walk. I'm just saying that not everybody. My mom and dad couldn't walk. I had to carry them.
Okay, thank you for your comment. So I think we're ready. And the 1 mile, I believe, is the consensus, and to move forward with. I will say that we're counting on you when we have these projects approved in the future to have these interblock connections so that people can travel easily from the project to the local streets. And then also, there may be potential issues going forward with making sure if I'm sure the developers will build enough parking for their residents so that there could be potential issues of parking spilling if there's not enough that's spilling in the community and have those concerns. So, but there's consensus enough to have a motion to implement your recommendations, but to include adding the mark station, including a 1 mile radius, right? And then present your general concerns over parking lot districts, so.
Yeah. Can I move that we,
Are we going to add a note for bringing a ZTA that how to measure?
Yeah, I think there's two issues that staff could continue to discuss and potentially come back to the board with on
Okay.
another ZTA. One of them was about the high-frequency local bus service. Another one was a more general, I think, amendment to the county code about how we are measuring distances. There's more complexity to that than we've discussed today that applies to several provisions in the code.
Okay, thank you. I'm good then.
Okay, so is there anything else? I think these were only two changes, correct?
Yeah.
All right. Do I have a motion to approve staff's recommendations as noted, including in the green here and taking out the verse half mile?
yeah. I'll move that we transmit the comments, staff's recommendations and comments on zoning text amendment 23-A, parking, et cetera, including the addition of the mark station and the 1 mile radius.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you again for these robust discussions on these ETAs. Thank you. And we'll take just 1 minute, and we'll go into our last item, which is item number 9, which is resolution of adoption of the Fairlands and Briggs Cheney Master Plan, where staff is recommending approve the resolution for adoption for transmittal to the full commission and receive briefings on changes made by the plan document after transmittal of the planning board draft to the county council. All right, thank you. Good afternoon. This is our last item of the afternoon of the day. It's item number 9, adoption, resolution for the adoption of the Fairland Briggs Cheney Master Plan, where staff is recommending approval of the resolution of adoption for transmittal to the full commission and receive briefing on changes made to the plan document after transmittal of the planning board draft to the county council. And Clark Larson from the Planning Department is here to give this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Again, Clark Larson with Up County Master Planning Division. I am one of the co-leaders of the plan, among others who have come before me. But we're here before you because, as was stated, the county council recently approved a resolution for the final version of the Fairland and Briggs Cheney Master Plan, and we are returning to you to approve the resolution for adoption to be sent on to the full commission, which constitutes the Montgomery Planning and Prince George's Planning boards. So as you'll recall, this update is a amendment to the 1997 Fairland Master Plan, a smaller area of the original plan area, as you see here in the black outline. This master plan is the first really more land use oriented master plan that's come before you since the adoption of Thrive 2050. And so this master plan really embraces the goals that are inherent in Thrive and seeks to flesh them out in various recommendations and thinking through how to accomplish these goals in our own master plan recommendations for this portion of East County. The master plan vision for the plan was to establish an evolving and connected suburban corridor with compact activity centers that support a healthy local economy and multicultural community that is socially connected and environmentally resilient, sort of summarizing the scope of all the recommendations and sections that are in the plan. And you'll recognize this graphic, as we've shown you before, with the progress of the master plan update. In red, we're showing the end point, just right before approval and adoption, where we are today. But this is the culmination of an effort since about the fall of 2021 to go through a series of community outreach and engagement activities, preliminary recommendations, working draft, public hearings, and so on. So this is really the end point of all the public input and staff work and community work that has come before. Included in your staff report is the resolution from the district council and, highlighting all the changes, all the technical changes and text changes, graphic changes that have occurred from the county council from the last draft that you recommended to them. So I won't go through that entire 12-page resolution with you. Also summarized in the agenda are some of these major points. I can read through some of these as summaries, but if there's any questions about them, if you prefer to hear them one by one versus just ask me questions as you read about them in the report, I'm happy to take any direction you direct.
Oh, this is great. You could just keep going. We're so proud of this master plan, and we'll ask any questions at the end if need be.
Okay, that's good. In addition, I wanted to bring forward some illustrations that you were unable to see in your draft plan. They were unavailable. We had just started putting them together with an illustrator. But these evoke the vision and development, transportation, environmental improvements that we expect in some of these corridors. So I'll go quickly through these just to show you that might be your first view of some of these illustrations, but they will be incorporated into the plan. So first is the Briggs Cheney Road corridor east of US 29. You can see there's more mid-rise and high-rise development, infilling some of the properties, more trees, structured parking, and so on. So that's our visions for establishing the Briggs Cheney Road corridor, what we term the Main Street in the master plan. Taking ourselves down to the street level, this is on the west side of US 29 at the intersection of Briggs Cheney Road and Old Columbia Pike. There's a smaller scale of buildings and heights with more pedestrian infrastructure, so wider sidewalks, more activated sidewalks than exist today, and a few homes and mixed-use developments filling in some of the gaps here. Moving south down, you can see the red star in the plan area where this perspective is. This is looking west along East Randolph Road towards the intersection with Old Columbia Pike. So on the far west, you can see a potential redevelopment at the Seventh-day Adventist World Headquarters, the corner of that property, and just how this intersection could become and could be experienced maybe in the 20 to 30 year future as building out from the master plan's vision. Now, going back into a drone or as a crow flies here, we're looking down on the Tech Road crossing of US 29. So this is looking a little bit more along the length of the Seventh-day Adventist World Headquarters property of one potential future, maintaining their existing building, but maybe filling in some of the parking areas and open space areas, and some of the other properties around that. So really at the near the intersection, you might see in the red lines, there's bus rapid transit lines here, so this would be one of the focal points of a bus rapid transit station, really trying to establish more higher density activated compact areas here. And then coming down to the street level, looking west across US 29 at Tech Road, more established and protected bicycle and walking and rolling facilities as it crosses US 29, and then buildings up to the street, more of a compact urban experience here as part of the plan's vision. So that's really the presentation that we have. Our request for you today is to approve a resolution of adoption for transmittal of the Fairland and Briggs Cheney Master Plan to the full commission for review at its meeting, which is scheduled on January 17th, 2024.
Thank you very much. Do any of the board members have any comments or questions?
I have a comment, and I want to commend you on this master plan, especially want to commend you on the tour that you organized. I'm very familiar with the Briggs Cheney area before Route 200 came in and where 29 directly intersected with Briggs Cheney. I used to go to Cameron Seafood there and Safeway. I don't know if you guys know if those stores existed or not, but the tour was really well organized, and it put together in my brain the future of Briggs Cheney, an area of the county that had been neglected. And this is to be commended, and I'm very thankful that some of my friends and family that live in this area will benefit from this master plan. Thanks.
And I wanted to echo what Commissioner Parkley said. I agree. That was my first tour for the master planning, and it was very useful for me. So keep those tours going. And frankly, thank you for bringing this as a last item for 2023. That's a very good way to close our year with such a wonderful, and for summer that is really needed. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to end, this is a wonderful master plan. It is our first master plan, and it is the first master plan after the adoption of Thrive Montgomery 2050. The council was so excited about it, and this was in Councilmember Mink's jurisdiction, and it's the first development proposed in decades, and so it's so important for the county through all the precepts of Thrive, and so thank you. It was a long process, and you did it, and congratulations. And I'd like to have a motion to approve a resolution of adoption for the transmittal of the Fairlands Briggs Cheney Master Plan to the full commission for its review at its meeting on January 17th, 2024.
I move to approve a resolution of adoption for the transmittal of the Fairland and Briggs Cheney Master Plan.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, the ayes have it. Before we end our last board meeting of the year, I'd like Ms. Stern to come up, please, and we'd like to give her a small token of our appreciation. Wherever you're like, come on up here. Yeah, this is a small token of the commission's office, including the board's appreciation for your dedicated work as being here for several years at the planning department and as being the deputy director, and over the past year as being the acting director of planning. So thank you so much for your hard work, your long work, your leadership, And we're so excited that you'll be moving on to Prince William as the planning director. Thank you so much for your hard work, and thank you. And then, and I think you have a green thumb, correct? So this is for your new office building, and to remind you of all of us, the planning department and the board. Thank you so much. Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. So the board meeting is just ended. Happy holidays to all of you. Thank you.